Hello, my dear friends. In the Middle Ages, a female orgasm could be considered a legitimate cure when women complained of fatigue, irritability, or daydreaming. They were not consoled, but sent to a convent to exorcise evil spirits. But what happened behind those closed doors is shocking. Where was the line between treatment and punishment? Who was allowed to act, and who was forced to close their eyes and endure? Tonight, we quietly return to the medieval world where desire was feared and medicine took a strange, intimate form. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a woman in the Middle Ages began to tremble, breathe heavily, or let out cries that sounded beyond her control, the explanation was rarely seen as natural. To the eyes of priests and the faithful, such reactions were signs that her body had been taken over by evil spirits. This belief shaped how women's health was understood, and it became the foundation for rituals that were meant to cleanse rather than heal. The connection between physical release and spiritual danger was drawn without hesitation, and so every visible sign of pleasure was rewritten as evidence of possession. Families brought their daughters and wives to the church with fear rather than comfort, convinced that what they saw was not an ordinary function of the body but the hand of the devil. The priests, in turn, did not deny this fear. They embraced it, for it reinforced their role as guardians of morality and power. Inside darkened chambers, rituals unfolded. A woman judged to be under the influence of spirits would be placed in a room with dim light and thick incense smoke. Candles flickered while the air grew heavy with resin and herbs. The priest would chant prayers, his words weaving a barrier against what he claimed was a demonic intrusion. Alongside these chants came physical acts. Cloth soaked in warm oils were pressed to the skin. Hands moved across the abdomen, thighs, and chest under the guise of exorcism. Each tremor, each cry was framed as proof that the ritual was working. When the body finally released its tension, the explanation was not relief from pain or a natural reaction, but rather the departure of a corrupting spirit. It is almost absurd that something as simple as a spasm of the body could be described as victory over demons, yet this was the logic that governed entire communities. The aftermath often carried a sense of calm. Women reported feeling lighter, their breathing steadier, their rest deeper. But the interpretation was not left to them. The priest would declare the treatment a success, announcing that the evil had been banished. Families left believing their loved one had been healed through divine will, never considering that what had occurred was a natural function of the body miscast as a sacred battle. To speak otherwise was unthinkable, for to question the explanation was to risk being accused of heresy. The reputation of these rituals spread. Villagers whispered about girls who had been freed from dark influences after nights of trembling in the presence of priests. Stories made their way through towns, reinforcing the belief that the church alone could handle such disturbances. Fear and trust combined into obedience. Women could not openly admit what they felt during these episodes, nor could they ask questions. To them, silence was safety. If we think of it in today's terms, it would be like visiting a hospital only to find that every symptom, from a cough to a broken arm, was treated as proof of possession and handled through prayer and ritual touching. The absurdity is striking, but in that age it was normalized. The social weight of these practices cannot be overstated. Women became subjects of surveillance, their bodies monitored for signs of strangeness. A sigh, a fainting spell, or a restless night could all be grounds for suspicion. Mothers warned their daughters not to draw attention, and husbands reported their wives for acting strangely. The cycle perpetuated itself because it affirmed the dominance of religious authority. The female body was not her own. It was a vessel to be inspected, corrected, and controlled. Inside convents, the same fears shaped routines. Young women who spoke of dreams or who appeared restless at night were taken into secluded rooms. Nuns carried out milder versions of the same rituals, using heated cloths, herbal baths, and whispered prayers. What happened behind those walls remained unspoken, but the pattern was clear. Relief came not from understanding the body, but from submitting it to procedures cloaked in sanctity. I cannot help but feel unsettled imagining how many women mistook ordinary bodily sensations for a curse because that was the only explanation offered to them. The environment itself played a role in sustaining belief. Stone chambers echoed with chants, the thick air of incense pressed against the skin, and the lack of light blurred perception. In that setting, reactions of the body could be framed as supernatural without challenge. The ordinary became extraordinary simply by changing the story told about it. No one dared to say that what looked like deliverance was in fact a physical release unrelated to spirits. These rituals also served a practical purpose for the church. By labelling bodily pleasure as evil, priests maintained control over both women's health and morality. Families became dependent on them for solutions, and dependence bred power. The more mysterious the reaction, the more authority the priest claimed. The less women understood their own bodies, the more they were bound to the institution that interpreted their every tremor. It was a cycle that reinforced itself with each frightened family and each silenced woman. For the women themselves, the experience was complex. Some left feeling truly relieved, convinced that they had been saved from darkness. Others carried shame, instructed to confess and repent, allowing their bodies to be vulnerable. A few returned again and again, not entirely sure whether they were ill, cursed, or simply seeking moments of release that could never be named aloud. Their private confusion remained buried beneath layers of doctrine and fear. This confusion was not accidental. It was cultivated. By framing pleasure as possession and exorcism as healing, the church made sure that knowledge of the body remained inaccessible. Women lived under the shadow of suspicion, bound by rituals they did not choose. Generations grew up without words to describe their own sensations. The silence became tradition, and tradition became truth. The notion that pleasure was evidence of the devil may seem laughable today, but it reveals how deeply control was woven into daily life. What should have been understood as natural was rewritten as unnatural. What could have been explained became forbidden. This legacy would shape how women were treated not only in the Middle Ages, but in the centuries that followed. The practice of labelling bodily reactions as demonic possession turned the most intimate parts of life into instruments of fear. Women were stripped of agency, priests were elevated in authority, and communities were bound tightly to the church. The result was a society that mistook ignorance for morality and superstition for medicine. In the end, the trembling of women in candlelit chambers tells us less about spirits and more about power. It shows how fragile understanding can be when knowledge is suppressed, and how easily fear can be used to shape the most personal aspects of life. The belief that pleasure was a mark of evil defined this era. Priests carried out their rituals with confidence. Families trusted in the process, and women bore the weight of misinterpretation. Relief was found, but its meaning was distorted, leaving behind a legacy of control. The tale of possession and exorcism was the first layer in a much larger pattern. Soon, new explanations emerged, ones that seemed scientific yet carried the same errors. These fresh ideas did not replace the old fears but built upon them, creating more elaborate justifications for what was never truly understood. And within those explanations lay an even stranger belief about the wandering of the womb. The idea that the womb could drift inside a woman's body was one of the most persistent misconceptions of the Middle Ages. It was believed that the uterus, rather than being anchored in place, was free to roam from one part of the body to another, pressing against the lungs, the heart, or the stomach. If a woman complained of shortness of breath, sudden fainting, or strange fits of emotion, it was said that her womb had wandered out of place. This theory was repeated in sermons, copied into manuscripts, and taught by physicians who had little chance to observe anatomy and reality. It became a convenient explanation for nearly every kind of ailment that women experienced, especially those that could not be easily measured or understood. Because this belief was so widespread, treatments followed that were designed to coax the womb back into its proper location. Warm compresses were placed on the abdomen, scented oils were rubbed into the skin, and heavy pressure was applied to the pelvis. Some healers even recommended vigorous rubbing or kneading of the lower belly. Confident that this would force the womb to return, women subjected to these treatments often shuddered, gasped, or cried out, and such reactions were taken as proof that the wandering organ had been set right. It is almost laughable that learned men of the time convinced themselves they were guiding an organ back into place when in truth, They were only provoking natural bodily responses. Another method used to treat the wandering womb involved manipulating scents. Physicians believed that the womb could be driven away from unpleasant odours and drawn toward pleasant ones. Bitter herbs or burning resins were held beneath the nose, supposedly repelling the womb from the upper body. At the same time, flowers or fragrant oils were applied between the thighs, meant to lure the organ downward. The woman herself was rarely given a choice in these rituals, and her physical reactions were interpreted not as signs of discomfort, but as evidence of success. To put it in modern terms, it would be as if doctors today claimed that headaches were caused by your heart sliding into your skull and prescribed incense to send it back down. In many cases, the physical manipulations led to outcomes that no one would acknowledge openly. The pressing, rubbing, and vibrations applied to the lower body sometimes caused involuntary release similar to sexual climax. Women who experienced this were not told that it was a natural reaction. Instead, the response was framed as further proof that the womb had been adjusted. The medical men could continue their work without admitting that what they witnessed was unrelated to their theory. The women themselves were left in confusion, unable to name what had happened, or to speak of it without risk of shame. Silence was encouraged, and ignorance was preserved. Knowledge of the body remained hidden, replaced by superstition repeated as fact. Women were discouraged from questioning the explanations given to them. Families, convinced that they were helping, brought their daughters and wives for treatment whenever strange symptoms arose. The cycle continued because it served the interests of those in power. If the womb was mysterious and dangerous, then physicians and priests retained control over the mystery. The settings of these treatments reinforced their authority. Dimly lit rooms filled with smoke and incense made the rituals seem solemn. The sound of prayers or chants echoed off stone walls, convincing families that the procedures were sacred rather than experimental. Women lay quietly on wooden benches, exposed to the touch of others under the claim of healing. The discomfort they felt was hidden beneath layers of ritual and interpretation. I find it unsettling to think of how many women must have endured confusion and even shame, simply because they trusted the authority of men who claimed to understand their bodies. The theory of the wandering womb also influenced social attitudes. If a woman was sad, anxious, or defiant, her behaviour could be dismissed as the fault of her restless uterus. Emotional struggles were not treated with compassion but labelled as symptoms of a disorder. This made it easier to control women. Since their words and feelings were stripped of credibility, the diagnosis was both medical and moral, placing blame on the body rather than on the environment or the circumstances of their lives. Medical texts of the era carried the error forward. Copyists reproduced diagrams that depicted the womb as an organ capable of movement. These manuscripts were studied by young students who later became physicians, ensuring that the myth persisted. Without dissection or proper anatomical study, there was no opportunity to correct the mistake. The lack of knowledge left space for imagination, and imagination was shaped by fear and control. Even when outcomes of treatment were positive, the explanations remained false. Relief often came because the body had been massaged, soothed with warmth, or distracted by scents. Instead of recognizing these simple effects, healers insisted that the womb had been restored. The truth was less important than maintaining authority. For women, the result was a mixture of genuine comfort and ongoing ignorance. They felt better, but never knew why. And so they returned again when symptoms appeared. The persistence of this belief shows how fragile knowledge was in the Middle Ages. One error, repeated across generations, came accepted as an unshakable truth. The cost of this error fell most heavily on women, who bore the treatments, the shame and the silence. They were turned into passive subjects of rituals that claimed to heal but often served to control. The myth of the wandering womb lasted because it supported existing structures of power. It allowed men to claim authority over women's bodies while hiding their own lack of understanding. The legacy of this theory stretched far beyond the treatments themselves. It shaped how women were seen, how their pain was judged, and how their voices were dismissed. By linking health to an imagined disorder, society found a convenient way to explain away female suffering without addressing its real causes. Poverty, malnutrition, and daily hardship were overlooked in favour of a myth that shifted blame to the body itself. In the end, the wandering womb was not just a medical mistake, it was a cultural tool, used to reinforce ignorance and dependency. Women lived under its shadow for centuries, enduring treatments that misunderstood their needs and denied them the right to knowledge. The idea of an organ moving freely through the body seems absurd today, but in its time it carried real power, shaping both medicine and society. The wandering womb was treated as fact, not myth. Women submitted to rituals designed to correct what was never broken, and healers claimed victory over a problem that never existed. Relief was real, but its meaning was stolen, leaving women confused and silent. The myth revealed how easily truth could be replaced by authority. It demonstrated how superstition could dominate science, and how fear could dictate medicine. It left behind a long history of misunderstanding that would echo into later centuries. The womb never wandered, but the idea of it wandering guided countless hands and silenced countless voices. This falsehood shaped the lives of women in ways that could not be undone. The belief in the wandering womb set the stage for even broader misconceptions. Soon, nearly every discomfort, from headaches to sleeplessness, would be gathered under one sweeping label that dismissed women as irrational and unstable. That label became known as the madness of femininity, and its consequences were even more damaging. Women in the Middle Ages were burdened with a label that erased the meaning of their suffering. Any discomfort they described, from headaches to sleepless nights to feelings of sadness, was quickly gathered under one name. Physicians and priests called it the madness of femininity. This phrase was used as a simple answer for complex realities, a way to explain away pain without truly addressing it. The diagnosis was not a careful study of symptoms, but a judgment passed on women themselves. In this way, almost every condition became a sign of instability, leaving women trapped in a cycle of misunderstanding. The diagnosis was wide and careless. If a woman fainted, she was said to be afflicted. If she complained of stomach pains, the cause was the same. Tears, anger, or even song could all be interpreted as disorder. This system left no room for individuality, no recognition that each woman's experience might have its own cause. Instead, all suffering was simplified into one label. It is almost ridiculous that entire communities accepted this single explanation as if women were incapable of any condition outside of madness. Treatments were shaped by the belief that something harmful was trapped inside the body and needed release. Women were told to breathe heavily, cry out, or strain themselves until exhausted. Some were shaken, some were rubbed with oils, and some were forced to shout or move violently until their bodies collapsed. Afterward, the calm that followed was interpreted as recovery. What often occurred was a release resembling orgasm, but this was never acknowledged directly. To compare, it would be like treating modern patients with depression by locking them in a room and demanding they scream until they passed out, then calling them cured because they were quiet afterward. The settings were rarely private. Women were placed in front of others, sometimes family, sometimes religious figures, and their reactions were observed closely. Each gasp, each cry became evidence of healing. The women themselves had no control over how their bodies were interpreted. They were told that their suffering had been purged, that their behaviour proved the treatment's effectiveness. Silence afterward was counted as obedience. These treatments left deeper scars than they cured. Women began to hide their pain, afraid of being declared mad. Complaints of fatigue or grief were kept secret. By suppressing their voices, they avoided humiliation but also denied themselves any chance of real care. The cycle was self-reinforcing the fewer women spoke. The more the label of madness seemed valid, the silence became proof of success when, in fact, it was proof of fear. The label itself carried weight beyond medicine. Husbands used it to dismiss their wives. Priests used it to demand obedience. Communities whispered it to shame those who stood out. Once branded as unstable, a woman lost credibility everywhere. Her testimony in daily life could be doubted, her independence questioned, and her suffering dismissed. I cannot help but feel disturbed imagining how grief, hunger, or anxiety could be twisted into accusations of instability simply because it was easier than listening. Medical texts reinforced the system. Manuscripts combined countless symptoms under one heading, speaking with authority while offering no true understanding. Students memorized these errors and carried them forward, ensuring the label persisted across generations. Without scientific study of the body, superstition filled the void. The result was a medical tradition that built itself not on evidence but on repetition of the same mistake. Inside homes. The impact was heavy. Women swallowed their pain rather than risk exposure. Families encouraged silence, believing it to be protection. Children grew up watching their mothers and sisters hide their discomfort, learning early that to complain was dangerous. The cycle of fear continued, supported by a system that promised order but delivered ignorance. The acceptance of physical release as a sign of recovery added confusion. Women who experienced such reactions during treatment were told they had expelled poison or evil. The real meaning of their body's responses was hidden, knowledge was denied, and ignorance was enforced. Relief was interpreted not as natural but as sacred. This ensured that women remained dependent on healers who claimed authority over their bodies. The madness label reflected the larger culture. It was convenient, simple, and protective of authority. By reducing all female suffering to a single cause, society avoided confronting poverty, hunger, abuse, and grief. These real issues were invisible under the shadow of madness. The cure was always the same, and so nothing ever improved. Families believed in recovery, but relapse was common, and the cycle began again. This approach reveals much about the time. It was not science that shaped medicine, but fear and superstition. It was not healing that motivated treatments, but the preservation of order. Women were left voiceless. Their pain turned into spectacle, their bodies exhausted under rituals that solved nothing. The madness of femininity was not only a medical mistake, but also a cultural weapon. The story of this label shows how misunderstanding can be used to maintain control. Women were silenced, their individuality erased, and their health reduced to myth. The relief they sometimes felt was real, but its meaning was stolen, hidden beneath claims of exorcism and cure. The legacy of that system lasted for centuries, shaping how women's pain continued to be dismissed long after the Middle Ages had passed. The broad label of female madness ensured that no symptom was truly understood. It left women dependent, communities misled, and medicine stagnant. It was a system that valued obedience over truth, silence over knowledge, and control over care. The diagnosis of madness set the stage for further practices. Soon, midwives and attendants would apply techniques of their own, often bringing relief through skilled touch, though they too refused to name what they were doing. These quiet acts opened another chapter, one where knowledge passed in whispers rather than in books, and secrecy defined how women cared for one another. Midwives in the Middle Ages occupied a position unlike any other. They were not priests, nor were they formally trained physicians, yet their knowledge of women's bodies was deeper than both. They were called during childbirth, during miscarriages, and when women complained of persistent aches and restless nights. They knew remedies that had been passed from one generation to the next. Not through books, but through practice and careful observation. Their authority came not from Latin texts or the blessings of the church, but from the trust of the women they helped. This trust gave them access to moments of vulnerability, where their touch and their mixtures of herbs offered relief. What they did in those moments often went beyond what was spoken aloud. When women suffered from tension in the abdomen or heaviness in the thighs, the midwives prepared oils. These were blends of rosemary, thyme, or sage, steeped in animal fats or pressed into ointments. The midwives would warm the mixture gently before applying it. With slow, rhythmic strokes, they massaged the belly, the hips, and the inside of the thighs. The women under their care often felt their bodies loosen. Breathing grew deeper, muscles relaxed, and sometimes their bodies shook with spasms that neither they nor the midwives named. It is striking how something as ordinary as careful massage was framed as mystical cleansing, while the true nature of the reaction was quietly ignored. These reactions were not random. The motions used by midwives had been refined over decades of observation. Some movements pressed firmly into the lower belly, while others followed lines along the thighs. The goal, as explained in whispers, was to ease the womb back to comfort or to release trapped air. But beneath the words was a simple truth. Women experienced a release that calmed them completely. After such treatments, many fell into a deep sleep, waking later with clearer eyes and lighter spirits. Families watching from outside the chamber often believed a miracle had taken place. Secrecy was essential. Midwives were already viewed with suspicion, tolerated only because their work was necessary for childbirth. To admit openly that their methods brought pleasure would have been dangerous. It could be twisted into accusations of sin, witchcraft, nor moral corruption. For that reason, They avoided naming what they did. They spoke instead of balancing humours, soothing wombs, or cleansing spirits. To imagine this today, it would be as if nurses provided proven treatments but were forced to call them rituals of purification rather than admit they brought physical release. The women who experienced these sessions carried conflicting feelings. They knew the relief was real. They felt calmer, more in control, and able to return to daily life. Yet they also carried the silence imposed on them. To speak of what they felt risked shame or danger. For many, the safest path was gratitude without explanation. They returned to the midwives when the same tensions arose again, trusting their hands but never naming the truth. This culture of hidden knowledge became part of women's lives. Mothers whispered to daughters about the herbs to use, the oils to prepare, and the motions that brought comfort. Instructions were passed in kitchens, fields, and birthing chambers, never written in books. The survival of this knowledge depended on being quiet. Open words could lead to persecution, but silence allowed it to endure. Cannot help but feel a deep respect for how women managed to preserve such understanding despite the fear pressing on them from every side. The contrast with the treatments offered by priests and physicians was sharp. Where men used ritual and authority, midwives used touch and care. Where priests framed suffering as possession, midwives addressed it as tension. Women trusted them because they recognized their experience. They saw the results not in chants or theories, but in the return of sleep and the easing of pain, even with risks. Burning herbs, inconsistent mixtures. The midwife's work remained more humane than the exhausting rituals of the church. Inside cottages or small rooms, the practice became routine. A woman would lie on a bed or a wooden bench, the midwife preparing oils beside her. The smell of herbs filled the air. The touch was firm yet steady, focused on areas that no priest or physician dared to acknowledge. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was also protective. The woman might tremble, gasp, or release tension she could not describe, and afterward, she would rest. When she woke, she felt renewed, and that alone was enough reason to trust. These practices reveal how much truth can live outside official stories. The midwives left little written evidence, yet their techniques shaped countless lives. What they knew was kept alive not through parchment but through repetition, through quiet acts of care that spoke louder than sermons. In their hands, women found comfort in a world that denied them understanding. The legacy of the midwives is one of survival. Their knowledge resisted suppression not through rebellion, but through adaptation. They wrapped their methods in safe words, kept their secrets close, and ensured that relief remained available even when it could not be explained. Their work reminds us that knowledge is not always carried in books. Sometimes it lives in hands, in gestures, and in the trust between women who must protect each other. The story of these healers shows how history can be split into two layers. The surface was filled with superstition, authority, and error. Beneath, there was practice shaped by experience, hidden by song, yet grounded in reality. This hidden layer gave women a fragile but vital form of control. The work of the midwives was not rebellion, but necessity. They provided care where official medicine failed, and they offered relief that could not be spoken. Their silence protected them, but it also concealed the truth. For the women who sought them, what mattered was not the words, but the outcome. A body eased, a spirit calmed, and the strength to continue. The image that remains is one of women lying quietly in small rooms, the air scented with herbs, their bodies trembling under careful hands, and then resting in deep sleep. Around them, a world of superstition and control continued, but within those moments, there was real healing. The quiet work of midwives created a hidden chapter in the history of women's health. It preserved knowledge that men in authority denied, and it offered comfort where rituals of fear prevailed. Relief was found, though its meaning was never named. This chapter of silence leads naturally into another, where rituals of cleansing passed into convent walls. There, young women were subjected to treatments cloaked as holy devotion, where the same motions were reframed as acts of spiritual purity. And in those secluded halls, secrecy reached an even deeper level. Convents in the Middle Ages were not only places of prayer and devotion, but also quiet centres of care for women whose behaviour troubled their families. When a young girl was restless at night, spoke of strange dreams, or seemed consumed by anxieties, she was often taken to the convent for correction. Within stone walls and heavy wooden doors, rituals were performed that combined fragments of medicine with the authority of religion. The official explanation was purification, a cleansing of the spirit through holy practices. Yet what occurred inside those closed chambers bore more resemblance to secret treatments than to acts of devotion. The nuns themselves became caretakers who blended prayer with touch, carrying out procedures that no one outside was meant to witness. The treatments began with the preparation of the room. Windows were shuttered, candles lit, and herbs placed to burn slowly on clay dishes. The thick smoke of rosemary and sage filled the air, believed to ward off unclean spirits and settle the body. The girl was asked to sit or lie quietly while the nuns moved around her, chanting prayers that echoed softly against the stone. A warm cloth, dipped in water infused with herbs, was pressed against her skin. The rubbing that followed was firm and steady, moving along her arms, her abdomen, and her thighs. To the eyes of the church, this was an act of cleansing. To the women themselves, it was a moment of intimate care disguised by ritual. It is almost ironic that what was called holy purification was in practice a careful massage meant to calm the body. The responses of the young women varied. Some grew drowsy as warmth spread through their muscles. Others trembled, their breathing quickening until they slumped back in exhaustion. These reactions were explained as proof that impurities had left or that restless spirits had been banished. Afterward, sleep came easily, and the women often woke calm and obedient. Families waiting outside saw only the results, not the methods. They were told that the convent had performed a silent miracle. The truth of the body's natural reactions was never spoken. This silence was deliberate. The nuns knew the danger of being accused of impropriety to protect themselves. They wrapped every action in layers of prayer and scripture. They described their work only as spiritual aid, never as physical treatment. Women leaving the convent were instructed not to speak of what had been done, only to thank God for their recovery. The secrecy gave the ritual power. It made it untouchable by critics, because no one could question what was never described. If we were to translate this into modern times, it would be as if hospital nurses treated patients through physical therapy, but forced them to call it divine intervention instead of care. Inside convent walls, this pattern became routine. Women came for periods of correction, returned home calmer, and then were sent back again when troubles returned. The cycle gave the convents quiet authority, not just as places of worship, but as hidden clinics. Families relied on them, trusting the mystery more than they trusted open explanations. The nuns, for their part, balanced faith with knowledge passed between women, guarding it carefully against suspicion. The secrecy shaped a culture of whispers. Among the sisters, details of which herbs soothed best and which motions brought the deepest rest were shared only in private. These lessons were taught not in texts but in practice. From older nuns to younger ones, the knowledge lived within their hands, not their words. What they could not acknowledge aloud, they passed through touch and repetition. I find myself imagining the unease they must have carried, knowing their work helped, but fearing it might be condemned if ever spoken too plainly. For the women who underwent these treatments, the experience was confusing. Relief came, but it was framed as divine grace. They could not describe their own sensations honestly, for to do so would be dangerous. Gratitude was expressed through prayer, not through understanding. Their bodies found rest, but their minds remained bound by silence. The contradiction was clear. The very institution that preached purity relied on hidden acts that could never be named. The image of the convent as a sanctuary concealed this hidden layer of activity. Outsiders saw walls of discipline and prayer, while inside, women were quietly soothed through warmth, herbs, and touch. This double existence shows how fragile truth can be when words are forbidden. What might have been called healing was disguised as ritual, and what might have been celebrated as knowledge was buried under secrecy. The impact of these practices stretched beyond the walls. Families grew dependent on convents to correct their daughters. Communities accepted the authority of the rituals without question. Women themselves learned to associate relief with silence, never daring to claim their own experience. The cycle ensured that knowledge remained controlled, passed quietly between those who carried it, but never allowed to surface in open discussion. The convents, like the midwives before them, demonstrate how women's health in the Middle Ages existed in two worlds. In one, public explanations wrapped suffering in superstition and control. In the other, private practices offered real comfort, though always cloaked in words of holiness. This split defined much of the female experience in that time, the reality of the body hidden beneath the language of the spirit. The story of convent purification is not only about healing but also about control. Women found relief, but they also learned obedience. Their recovery was celebrated not as understanding but as submission. What should have been acknowledged as natural was turned into proof of divine correction. In this way, the convents preserved the same patterns of authority found in churches and courts, even as they quietly eased the pain of those who came to them. The rituals of cleansing in convents reveal the contradictions of the Middle Ages. They show how secrecy allowed knowledge to survive while also keeping it fragile. They remind us that even within institutions devoted to faith, women found ways to care for each other, though never in words that risked exposure. The convents became places where suffering was soothed but never explained, where truth was hidden yet practiced daily. They stand as quiet witnesses to a world where healing existed in the shadows of silence. What happened within convent walls points us toward the growing involvement of male healers who claimed authority over the body. These figures would step forward with examinations cloaked as science, placing their hands where they claimed to search for illness, and prolonging treatments until women's bodies reacted in ways they could justify as a cure. In the Middle Ages, the line between medical practice and personal intrusion was often blurred, especially when it came to the treatment of women. Among the most unsettling examples were the examinations carried out by healers who claimed to be searching for signs of illness in the lower abdomen and thighs. These men, often calling themselves physicians or traditional healers, insisted that their touch was guided by ancient medical wisdom. They argued that the womb and its surrounding areas held the secrets to women's health, and that by pressing, and rubbing or manipulating the lower body, they could diagnose and correct disorders. The justification sounded authoritative to families desperate for answers, but in reality, the methods opened a door for exploitation. Women were told to lie still on benches or wooden tables, their clothing adjusted to allow access to the areas deemed necessary for examination. Oils were sometimes applied, said to warm the blood and relax the womb. Hands moved slowly across the abdomen, pressing firmly and pausing as though searching for hidden causes of sickness. When women reacted with shudders or gasps, the healer would claim that circulation was improving or that blockages were being released. These responses were written down as medical success. It is difficult not to see the absurdity of calling a woman's involuntary tremor proof of restored health when it was simply the natural response of her body to prolonged touch. The sessions often lasted far longer than necessary. Healers argued that patience was needed, that the womb was stubborn and required repeated coaxing. In practice, this meant women were subjected to extended handling until their bodies reacted in ways that could be interpreted as therapeutic. Families observing nearby were reassured by the healer's confident words, while the women themselves had no safe way to question what was happening. Their silence was treated as compliance, and their reactions were framed as proof of improvement. These practices thrived because they were cloaked in the authority of tradition. Medical texts copied from ancient sources described the womb as sensitive and prone to disorder, which gave credibility to the idea that direct handling was necessary. Communities accepted the explanations, believing that what looked uncomfortable must be healing. Women were told that their health depended on submission to the process, and refusing it risked being labelled disobedient or ignorant. If compared to modern times, it would be as if doctors insisted on treating every case of stomach pain with prolonged touching, then recorded the patient's blush or tremor as evidence of success. For the women, the experience was confusing and often humiliating. They could feel their bodies reacting, but they were given no words to describe it honestly. Instead, they were told that the spasms were signs of restored balance, that the womb had been soothed, or that bad airs had been released. The relief they sometimes felt afterward was credited to the healer's wisdom rather than acknowledged as a natural response. This left them uncertain of what had truly happened, and dependent on further sessions when discomfort returned. The atmosphere in which these examinations took place added to their authority. Rooms were dimly lit, with herbs burning in small bowls to create a sense of solemnity. The scent of smoke mingled with the sound of chants or whispered instructions. Families were often nearby, reinforcing the idea that the ritual was proper. Every detail was arranged to make the experience seem necessary, even holy, despite the discomfort of the women enduring it. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine how many women submitted to these examinations, believing they were being healed, while in truth they were caught in a cycle of control disguised as care. These practices reflected the broader attitudes of the time. Women's bodies were seen as mysterious, unstable, and prone to illness that only men could interpret. Their voices were not trusted, their knowledge of their own sensations ignored. Instead, the reactions of their bodies under manipulation became the measure of health. This robbed them of agency and turned their experiences into data for others to interpret. The exploitation was not always intentional, but the system allowed for it. Some healers may have believed sincerely in what they were doing, guided by texts that spoke of wombs wandering and humours trapped in the belly. Others, however, clearly took advantage of the permission granted by their role. They prolonged treatments unnecessarily, sought out reactions they knew would come, and declared them as cures. The lack of oversight meant there was little to stop them. The consequences were lasting. Women returned home, told that their wombs had been corrected, only to face the same discomfort weeks later. They went back to the healers, convinced that another round of examination was needed. Families supported this, believing it to be essential care. The cycle repeated, ensuring dependence while never addressing the true causes of suffering. The story of these examinations highlights how authority can mask intrusion. By presenting their methods as a medical necessity, healers secured trust and access that women could not refuse. What should have been private became public, and what should have been questioned was accepted as truth. In the larger picture, these practices fit into the ongoing pattern of misunderstanding women's health in the Middle Ages. The body was interpreted through superstition, controlled by authority, and subjected to treatments that blurred the line between healing and harm. Women endured because they had no alternative, and their relief was defined not by their own words but by the claims of others. These examinations were described as ways to improve circulation and restore balance, but in reality they reinforced dependence and silence. Women's reactions were framed as cures, their discomfort hidden beneath the weight of medical authority. The legacy of these practices is a reminder of how fragile truth becomes when knowledge is denied and control is disguised as care. The healers who prolonged their examinations created more than temporary relief. They shaped expectations of what treatment should look like, making families believe that long sessions and visible reactions were necessary. This expectation would carry forward into other rituals and other settings, influencing how women were treated for centuries. The examinations of the lower body, justified as medicine, left behind a troubling history. They show how easily authority can redefine intrusion as healing, and how women's silence can be mistaken for consent. The pattern did not end here. Soon, new explanations would emerge, centered on the idea that women's illnesses came from blockages of vital fluids, from trapped energies that needed to be released. The treatments for these blockages would once again involve touch, heat, and forced reactions, continuing the cycle of misunderstanding under a different name. In medieval thought, the female body was described as a vessel that easily trapped impurities. Physicians and healers argued that because women did not release what they called vital fluids, their bodies became congested. This belief framed nearly every form of discomfort, from headaches to restlessness, as evidence of blocked energies. The explanation was simple, but misleading women suffered because their bodies held on to what should have been expelled. The cure, they said, was to draw out these toxins through ritual, heat, and touch. In practice, this meant subjecting women to procedures that forced visible reactions, then labelling those reactions as proof of healing. The treatments often began with herbs, nettle, sage, or wormwood was boiled in pots until their steam filled the room. The patient, usually a young woman or wife brought in by her family, was asked to sit or crouch over the rising vapour. Blankets or heavy cloths were wrapped around her to trap the heat, so that the fumes would penetrate her body. As the minutes passed, her breathing grew laboured, her skin slick with sweat, and her muscles tense from the suffocating warmth. Healers insisted this was the sign of impurities loosening. They claimed that the body would soon expel what had been trapped inside. It is astonishing how ordinary sweating and trembling were rebranded as proof of evil vapours leaving the body. The next stage often involved massage. Warm oils made from herbs were rubbed onto the abdomen and thighs, the healer pressing in circles or stroking firmly till the woman began to gasp or twitch. Any movement was taken as success, a visible demonstration that the obstruction was breaking apart. When women's bodies reacted more strongly, producing spasms or fluids, the healer would declare that the blockage had been cleared. Families standing nearby accepted these words without question, relieved to hear that the suffering had been addressed. The reality was far less clear. Women might feel temporarily lighter after such sessions, but the underlying problems of poverty, poor nutrition, or stress were untouched. The relief was short-lived, yet the rituals gave the impression of control. Communities grew accustomed to the cycle illness declared as blockage, reactions seen as cure, and the return of symptoms treated as proof that another session was required. If imagined in modern times, it would be like claiming that forcing someone into a sauna until they fainted could cleanse them of depression or anxiety. The experience for the women themselves was difficult. They were told to endure heat until their heads spun and their bodies shook, while those around them looked on with approval. Their reactions, which might have been shameful or frightening in other contexts, were here celebrated as victory. Yet they had no chance to explain what they truly felt. The explanations were already written for them. What they experienced was not treated as personal, but as evidence of theories created by men who would never endure the same treatments. The rituals reinforced silence. Women were not supposed to question the methods or describe their sensations honestly. Instead, they were encouraged to see themselves as vessels of impurity, emptied only by the intervention of others. This perspective stripped them of authority over their own bodies. It made them dependent on healers who repeated the same rituals again and again, turning natural responses into a cycle of managed suffering. I cannot help but think how exhausting it must have been to know that every tremor or breath would be interpreted not as one's own, but as proof of someone else's theory. In the dim rooms where these sessions took place, the atmosphere was heavy with smoke and secrecy. The smell of burning herbs clung to the walls, and the hiss of boiling water mixed with whispered prayers. The women crouched under cloths or lay on benches, their bodies shaking. While healers leaned in with confident gestures, the setting made it all seem inevitable, even sacred. For families, the sight of sweat and exhaustion was reassuring, because it looked like work being done, like illness leaving the body. The consequences of these beliefs stretched beyond the individual. Entire communities learned to accept discomfort and suffering as signs of impurity. They believed that the female body required constant correction, that it could not regulate itself without intervention. This shaped how women were viewed, making them appear weaker, more dependent, and perpetually in need of guidance. The rituals became not only medical treatments, but also tools of social control. What stands out is the resilience of women who endured these practices. Despite the discomfort, they carried on with daily life, caring for children, tending homes, and working in fields. Their strength was hidden behind the language of impurity and correction, but it was present in every act of survival. While healers claimed success, the women themselves bore the true cost. The theory of blocked fluids persisted for centuries because it was simple and visible. Reactions could always be produced with enough heat or pressure, and those reactions could always be explained as successful. The cycle reinforced itself, leaving little room for doubt. In a society where questioning authority was dangerous, such theories flourished unchecked. These treatments tell us more about the priorities of the time than about women's health. They reveal a culture more concerned with appearances and control than with a genuine understanding. They show how easily natural bodily reactions can be misinterpreted when power rests in the hands of a few. The rituals built around blocked fluids shaped not only how women were treated, but also how they were perceived. They were cast as unstable, impure, and perpetually in need of cleansing. This image reinforced their dependence and limited their freedom. In the quiet aftermath of these sessions, when the herbs had burned down and the women rested in exhaustion, families gave thanks and healers claimed success, but the cycle was never broken, and the truth of the body remained hidden beneath layers of superstition. These beliefs, however, were not the final word. In the rooms where herbs were burned and women were made to tremble, another stage of treatment was already being prepared. This stage would take place in darker chambers, lit by faint lamps and filled with the heavy smell of resins, where secrecy grew even deeper and the reactions of the body were cloaked as encounters with divine power. Rooms used for treatments in the Middle Ages were arranged to create an atmosphere of mystery and control, rather than bright sunlight. Healers preferred spaces closed off from the outside world. Heavy shutters blocked the windows, leaving the room in near darkness, with only faint candlelight flickering against the walls. This dim setting was explained as protection from evil spirits, for strong light was thought to invite intrusion from forces unseen. The shadows, however, also concealed what truly took place inside. Families waiting outside heard only whispers and muffled sounds, never witnessing the details. What happened in those rooms was left to imagination, framed as sacred work that could not be questioned. The rituals began with the burning of resins and roots. Pine pitch was melted on small dishes, its thick smoke curling upward to fill the air. Mandrake, a root long tied to superstition, was ground and thrown onto coals, releasing a heavy bitter scent. The air grew dense, difficult to breathe, as women were placed in positions designed to open the lower body. Kneeling was common, sometimes with blankets arranged around them to trap the fumes. As the herbs burned, sweat began to form on their skin, their breath grew shallow, and their bodies responded to the heat and pressure rising from below. It is almost comical to think that dizziness and trembling from smoke and heat were reinterpreted as holy spirits at work. The women undergoing these sessions often lost their sense of time. The dim light, the thick smoke, and the repetition of prayers created a haze that blurred minutes into hours. Healers stood nearby, chanting softly and watching closely for any physical reaction. When a woman shuddered, gasped, or collapsed in exhaustion, the event was seized upon as proof that the treatment had succeeded. It was said that the spirit within her had been forced out, or that her womb had been purified by the holy air. Families were reassured with these explanations, convinced that what they had witnessed was divine intervention. Every detail of the setting reinforced this belief. The darkness, the smoke, the faint glow of candles. Together they created an environment where ordinary reactions could be framed as extraordinary. Women's spasms were described not as the body's natural response, but as signs of unseen forces departing. The room itself became part of the cure, shaping interpretation as much as any touch or herb. If compared to the present day, it would be as if a patient fainted in an overheated sauna and doctors declared it a triumph of spiritual cleansing. These rooms were not large, often little more than small chambers attached to convents, homes, or healers' workshops. Their confinement made the atmosphere more intense. Air grew stale quickly, heavy with smoke that clung to skin and clothing. Women leaving such places carried the smell of resin and sweat, a physical reminder of what they had endured. They returned to families tired but calmer, and the outward appearance of peace was enough to justify the practice. No one asked whether the relief came from exhaustion rather than true healing. The secrecy of the setting also gave the rituals power, because outsiders were rarely allowed to see. The stories that spread about what happened inside grew more exaggerated. Whispers spoke of women convulsing, of voices crying out, of spirits fleeing the body. These tales reinforced the authority of the healers, making families more eager to send their daughters or wives for treatment. Silence became part of the ritual itself, protecting it from doubt. For the women, the experience was often frightening. The heat, the smoke, the closeness of the room made breathing hard, and the reactions of their bodies felt overwhelming. Yet they had no language to describe what they endured, only the explanations given to them afterward. They were told that their shudders were signs of release, that their weakness was proof of cleansing. Their own feelings were pushed aside, replaced by words that belonged to others. I cannot help but feel the weight of that silence, where women's true voices were smothered by rituals designed to interpret their every breath as something beyond their control. The arrangement of these rooms also symbolized the way society handled women's health, hidden, controlled, and framed through fear. Just as the chambers blocked out the light, the truth of women's bodies was kept in darkness. What might have been understood as natural was transformed into mystery, and what might have been questioned was declared sacred. The lasting impact of these practices was profound. Generations grew accustomed to the idea that women needed secret, smoky chambers for their health. The image of trembling in candlelight became tied to the idea of healing, ensuring that women themselves learned to accept these treatments as inevitable. The very setting taught them that suffering was part of purification, and that silence was the price of recovery. The use of closed, smoky rooms stands as one of the clearest examples of how superstition and control shape medicine. The environment was as much a tool as the herbs or the prayers. It made the ordinary appear extraordinary, disguising discomfort as sacred release. Women were left with exhaustion and silence, while healers claimed victory and families believed the danger had passed. Within these chambers, the truth of the body was hidden behind smoke and shadows. Women emerged calmer, but also more bound to a cycle they could not escape. The memory of what they endured lingered, but the words to explain it were never allowed. This reliance on secret spaces prepared the ground for new forms of explanation. Soon, the tremors and gasps that filled those rooms would be redefined yet again, not as spiritual release, but as mysterious processes of the womb itself. The same reactions would be renamed, reshaped, and used to reinforce control under a different vocabulary. Medieval healers and the priests rarely spoke directly about what women's bodies experienced. When spasms, gasps, or trembling appeared during treatments, these reactions were carefully hidden under different names. Instead of acknowledging pleasure, they called it purification, release, or cleansing of the womb. Words like expelling toxins or washing the organs were used to frame what happened as something holy and corrective. This choice of language was not accidental. By avoiding the true term for physical pleasure, those in power ensured that control stayed firmly in their hands. Women could not name what they felt, and without a name, their experience was easy to reshape into something entirely different. The use of vague labels served many purposes. It allowed priests to continue their rituals without facing accusations of impropriety, since they claimed only to be helping women rid themselves of bad airs or spiritual impurities. It reassured families who might otherwise be unsettled by the visible reactions of their daughters or wives, and it gave the healers authority, since they alone could explain what the spasms meant. The women themselves were left silent. Their natural responses were interpreted for them, redefined as evidence of illness corrected rather than sensations of their own. It is almost laughable to think that a simple physical release was disguised as a mystical cleansing, yet the disguise was enough to maintain authority. This manipulation of language was powerful. Without clear words, women had no framework to understand their own bodies. They could not claim knowledge or discuss their experiences openly. Instead, they were taught to see their reactions as symptoms that required external control. The lack of vocabulary became another chain, binding them to silence. If translated into a modern setting, it would be as if patients today were forbidden from using medical terms and forced to call every treatment a miracle. Leaving all explanation in the hands of others inside treatment rooms, these terms were repeated with solemnity. When a woman convulsed, the healer would announce that the womb had been freed of its burdens. When she sighed in exhaustion, it was called the release of trapped humours. When fluids appeared, they were said to be poisons, leaving the body. Every sign of natural arousal or climax was transformed into something else, stripped of its true meaning. The women, already weakened by heat, pressure, or smoke, had no choice but to accept these explanations. The Church reinforced this approach by forbidding open discussion of sexual pleasure. Pleasure was linked with sin, temptation, and the devil's influence. To acknowledge that women could feel it, especially in religious or medical settings, would have challenged the foundations of control. By erasing the word, they erased the possibility of women recognizing their own capacity for desire. In this way, language became a tool of dominance, shaping not only what women could say but also what they could imagine. For many women, this silence was confusing. They felt relief and even comfort after treatments, but they were told it was a cleansing of the spirit. Gratitude was expected, not curiosity. They learned to interpret their own sensations as signs of obedience, rather than as expressions of their bodies. Over time, the repeated use of vague terms built a culture where women themselves avoided naming pleasure, convinced that to do so would mark them as impure or possessed. I find it unsettling how effectively words were used to erase reality, leaving generations of women unable to describe the most basic aspects of their own bodies. The avoidance of the true name also protected the healers from scrutiny if they had admitted that their methods produced pleasure. Questions of morality and intention would have followed. By redefining reactions as purification, they kept themselves safe. Communities accepted the explanations, convinced that what looked suspicious was in fact holy work. The disguise became self-sustaining, repeated from one generation to the next until it seemed natural. This pattern reveals how much power rests in language. By controlling words, the authorities controlled experiences. They created a world where women's truths could be hidden in plain sight, reshaped until they served the needs of others. The trembling of her body was no longer her own, but evidence of spiritual correction. The sigh of release was no longer hers, but proof of impurity expelled. The act of naming was taken away, and with it, the chance for women to claim ownership of their sensations. The consequences stretched far beyond the treatment rooms. In homes, families repeated the same vague terms when speaking of women's health. In communities, rumours spread using the same coded language. Over time, the absence of clear words left entire societies unable to speak directly about female experience. Silence became normal, and what could not be spoken about could not be understood. By refusing to name pleasure, medieval culture not only denied women knowledge, but also reinforced their dependence. They were made to believe that what happened to them was mysterious, dangerous, and always in need of correction. Their bodies became objects of ritual rather than subjects of understanding. The erasure of the word created a long shadow. Even centuries later, echoes of this silence remained, with female pleasure often dismissed, ignored, or pathologized. The seeds of that silence were planted in those medieval rooms where vague terms replaced truth and secrecy replaced honesty. The story of unnamed pleasure reminds us how deeply control can shape language, and how language in turn can shape reality. What could not be named could not be owned. Women's bodies became sites of mystery, not because they were unknowable, but because they were deliberately misdescribed. These layers of silence set the stage for what came next. Women who experienced relief sometimes described it as feeling weightless, as though lifted from their burdens. Yet even this was quickly recast by priests as a sign of danger, a moment that required confession to cleanse the soul. The cycle of pleasure, guilt, and silence deepened, binding women even more tightly to the authority of those who name their experiences for them. After undergoing treatments in dimly lit chambers filled with smoke and ritual, some women described a strange sense of lightness that came afterward. They spoke quietly of deep sleep that followed the sessions, of waking with bodies that felt less heavy, and minds that seemed clearer. The tension they had carried for days or weeks was gone, replaced by a calm that made even daily chores seem easier. Families noticed the difference too, seeing women return from the healer or the convent with calmer expressions and renewed energy. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the treatments had worked in the most practical way, offering genuine relief from pain and worry. Yet this relief was not celebrated openly. The moment a woman admitted to feeling lighter or more content, she was reminded by priests or confessors that such sensations were not entirely safe. She was told that her body had been opened, that the experience she described was a sign of vulnerability to temptation. Instead of being encouraged to understand her reaction as natural, she was warned that she had let dangerous forces in. It is almost ridiculous to imagine that a woman's sense of well-being could be branded as a spiritual weakness rather than acknowledged as evidence of healing. The instruction that followed was always the same confession. Women who described their lightness were sent to kneel before priests and recite prayers of repentance. They were told to seek forgiveness for having allowed their flesh to respond too freely. What had felt like a blessing was reframed as a sin, an opening of the self to the devil's influence. Families accepted this explanation without question, relieved to believe that the priest had corrected what the healer had begun. For the women, however, the experience was deeply conflicting. They carried both the memory of comfort and the weight of guilt. This cycle created a strange contradiction. Relief was achieved, but it was immediately overshadowed by shame. Women learned to distrust their own sensations, to treat their calm and their joy as suspicious. The treatments that brought them peace also delivered them into confessionals, where their voices were guided into prayers of apology. If compared with today, it would be as if patients were scolded for feeling better after medicine, told that their recovery was proof they had given in to weakness. The emotional toll of this contradiction was heavy. Women carried the memory of rest but dared not speak of it openly. Instead, they buried their gratitude beneath layers of guilt. Some avoided mentioning how good they felt at all, fearing that their words would only bring more punishment. Others accepted the cycle, treating confession as part of the healing, even though it robbed them of the chance to truly understand their own bodies. Inside convents, this pattern became a standard rhythm. A woman would arrive tense and anxious, undergo the rituals of smoke, heat, or massage, then leave with her body calmer. Almost immediately, she was reminded to confess. Her relief was acknowledged only through the lens of sin and forgiveness. The institution preserved its control by ensuring that even positive outcomes did not belong to the women themselves. I find it deeply troubling to imagine how many women learned to associate their own peace with guilt, never allowed to enjoy the comfort they briefly found. This system kept women trapped between silence and submission. To speak of their relief was to risk reprimand. To stay silent was to erase their experience. Either way, their sensations were not their own. Authority belonged to those who named them, whether healer or priest. The women themselves became passive subjects, vessels through which others reinforced their theories and their power. The broader culture reflected the same message. Relief and pleasure were seen not as natural outcomes, but as signs of weakness. Women were cast as fragile beings who required constant supervision, not only of their actions but of their feelings. The church emphasized that the body was a gateway for sin, and so even sensations that pointed to healing had to be controlled. The result was a society where women distrusted themselves, unable to separate natural responses from imposed narratives. Generations grew up under this pattern. Daughters learned from mothers that to feel lighter after treatment was both a blessing and a burden. Words of gratitude were whispered in kitchens or behind closed doors, never spoken in public. The memory of peace was passed along with warnings to remain guarded. Over time, the silence became tradition, and the association between well-being and guilt grew stronger. The contradiction stands out as one of the cruelest features of medieval attitudes toward women's health. At the very moment when women could have begun to trust their own bodies, they were told instead to distrust them even more. Relief was possible, but understanding was forbidden. Their experiences were stolen twice, first by being renamed, then by being condemned. The stories of these women remind us how deeply authority can shape even the most personal sensations. By dictating how women interpreted their own feelings, the church ensured that they remained dependent, obedient, and silent. The cycle of treatment and confession was not only about health, but also about power. The women who left those rooms carried both peace and shame. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies had given them comfort, but that their souls had been marked as weak. The relief they felt was genuine, yet it was always overshadowed by fear. This pattern of mixing healing with guilt did not end here. Soon, other practices would emerge, pushing women into even harsher forms of ritual, where their discomfort was heightened, and their reactions interpreted as proof of possession or disorder. The association between the body's responses and moral judgment only deepened, preparing the ground for even more intrusive forms of control. Young women in the Middle Ages who appeared melancholy or restless were quickly labelled as troubled. Families feared that sadness or unusual behaviour meant possession or illness, and so the solution offered was often a ritual of steaming. These sessions took place in small, sealed rooms where air grew heavy and breath became strained. A large pot of boiling water mixed with herbs such as sage, thyme, or rosemary was placed beneath a wooden seat or stool. The young woman was told to sit over it while attendants fanned the coals to keep the steam rising. The thick vapour clung to her skin and penetrated her body, making her sweat until her clothes were damp and her hair stuck to her face. The heat was overwhelming, but to onlookers, this was a sign that the body was being cleansed of its hidden troubles. The attendants took their role seriously, believing that the steam itself carried away impurities. They adjusted the blankets around the girl to trap the vapour, forcing her to breathe the bitter, sharp smell of boiled herbs. Her face flushed, her breathing quickened, and soon drops of sweat ran down her neck and chest. Sometimes the steam burned against sensitive skin, but no complaint was accepted. The ritual had to continue till her body gave a visible reaction, whether shivering, tremblings, or releasing fluids. It is grimly ironic that exhaustion and near collapse were celebrated as triumphs of healing. For the young women, the experience was confusing and frightening. They entered the steaming chamber feeling weak, only to be subjected to an ordeal that pushed their bodies past comfort. The dizziness, the trembling, the sense of suffocation. These were all explained away as proof that impurities were leaving. If they fainted, it was called a breakthrough. If they gasped for air, it was said the spirit inside them was finally departing. Their suffering was framed as success, leaving no space for their own voices. The herbs themselves varied, but the effect was similar. Strong-smelling plants were believed to open the body and drive out melancholy. The pungent vapour burned the throat and eyes, making women cry involuntarily. These tears were taken as another sign of cleansing. Families who waited outside often felt reassured when they saw their daughters return pale, weak and silent, believing this meant the sickness had been expelled. If imagined in modern times, it would be like placing a young woman in a sauna until she fainted, then announcing she was cured of sadness. The treatments were repeated whenever symptoms reappeared. A girl who continued to dream restlessly or cry quietly at home could expect to be sent back into the steaming room. Over time, many learned to hide their feelings, fearing that any display of sadness would result in another session. Silence became safer than expression, and compliance was mistaken for recovery. Inside the rooms, the atmosphere was harsh and stifling. The floor grew slippery with condensed steam, the walls damp with moisture. Attendants kept the fires alive, adding herbs to intensify the scent. The girl sat hunched on the stool, sweat dripping, the cloth covering her body clinging tightly. Every tremor of her limbs, every quickened breath was watched closely and interpreted as progress. The moment her strength gave way, the ritual was declared finished. The physical toll was significant. Skin sometimes blistered from prolonged exposure to steam, lungs grew irritated, and weakness lingered for days. Yet none of this was recorded as harm. Instead, it was woven into the narrative of healing. Reinforcing the belief that the process worked, women were told they should be grateful, and many repeated the words even as they dreaded the next session. I find it unsettling to imagine how many young women endured this in silence, never able to admit that the treatment itself was the source of their suffering. The practice of steaming reflects how little room medieval society left for a genuine understanding of women's health. Emotional struggles were not seen as natural responses to hardship, but as signs of disorder that demanded correction. The treatments did not ask why women felt sadness or anxiety. They focused only on forcing reactions that could be labelled as cures. This approach silenced women twice, first by denying their feelings, and then by turning their suffering into supposed evidence of recovery. Communities supported the rituals because they offered visible results. A woman who left the steaming room limp and quiet looked different from the one who had entered restless and emotional. That difference was enough to convince families that something meaningful had happened. They did not see that the change came from exhaustion, not healing. The cycle continued because it seemed to provide answers, even though it deepened women's vulnerability. Over time, the ritual of steaming became one of the most common responses to female melancholy. It combined the authority of tradition with the drama of physical reaction, making it hard to challenge to those who practiced it. The evidence was undeniable. Women shook, sweated, and grew still, which must have meant the cure had worked. In reality, these sessions left women weaker and more fearful, their sadness untreated, their bodies strained. The rituals reinforced the belief that women could not be trusted to understand their own emotions, and that control had to come from outside. The steaming chambers, thick with smoke and sweat, became symbols of how easily suffering could be misinterpreted as progress. The story of these treatments highlights the deep gulf between experience and interpretation in the Middle Ages. Women endured reactions they could not name, while others claimed the right to explain them. Their sadness was never addressed, only reshaped into a cycle of silence and ritual. These rituals of forced heat and hidden pain prepared the way for even more troubling explanations. Soon, the very convulsions and spasms women displayed would be declared signs not of melancholy, but of possession, evidence that their souls were under attack, and the treatments would grow harsher still, as priests stepped in to claim authority over the body and spirit alike. During the Middle Ages, the reactions of women's bodies were rarely taken at face value. When a woman trembled, gasped, or cried out during a ritual, the event was not seen as a physical response, but rather as evidence of spiritual forces at work. Convulsions were called signs that unclean spirits had left the womb. Shudders and spasms were explained as the soul purging itself of sickness. What might have been understood as natural reactions to pressure, heat, or touch were instead described as encounters with the divine. Women were left voiceless, told that their experiences were proof of something beyond them, never their own. The words used to frame these reactions mattered deeply. A spasm was called the spirit leaving the sick womb. A sigh was said to be air released from impurity. Fluids were explained as toxins escaping through divine intervention. By covering every sign with spiritual vocabulary, the healers and priests ensured that women could not claim their sensations for themselves. The body no longer belonged to the woman experiencing it. It belonged to those who interpreted it. It is almost absurd to imagine that something so personal as bodily pleasure was transformed into evidence of holy punishment. This system of explanation carried authority because it reassured families and communities. Instead of being alarmed by the intensity of women's reactions, they were told to see them as progress. A daughter convulsing on the floor was not a cause for panic but for relief. Since it meant the ritual had worked, parents could leave the treatment chamber convinced that evil had been forced out, while priests strengthened their own influence by controlling the narrative. The woman herself had no chance to describe what she felt in her own words. The silence placed upon women was deliberate. They were discouraged from asking questions and told never to resist. To speak of pleasure, relief, or even fear was dangerous. Instead, they were reminded that their bodies were weak vessels, easily invaded by spirits and only made clean through submission. The message was clear: obedience was the cure, and silence was the virtue. If placed in modern terms, it would be like doctors today declaring that a patient's relief after treatment was not recovery but proof of sin, demanding gratitude for punishment instead of care. The emotional toll was immense. Women left treatments with bodies lighter and calmer, but their comfort was rebranded as a side effect of divine chastisement. Instead of pride or understanding, they carried guilt. What they felt was framed not as healing, but as proof of corruption burned away. This distorted logic ensured that no woman could claim ownership of her own sensations. Every tremor, every sigh, every release was taken from her and reshaped into the language of the church. The ritual settings amplified this sense of control. The rooms were dark, filled with smoke, with priests or attendants chanting steadily. The weight of candles and incense created an atmosphere of gravity that discouraged questions. Women knelt or lay still, often surrounded by onlookers who reinforced the interpretation of every movement. Their private responses were made public, interpreted aloud, and then folded into a story that erased their own truth. I find it deeply troubling to imagine how many women carried the memory of comfort tainted by shame, never allowed to call it their own. The practice also reinforced broader cultural patterns. Pleasure was associated with danger, so it had to be disguised. Women's voices were dismissed, so interpretations were imposed. Authority rested entirely with men, whether healers, priests, or observers. Women became passive figures in stories told about them, rather than active participants in their own lives. The cycle repeated across communities, making sense and misinterpretation part of everyday reality. Generations of women grew up under this weight. Mothers who had endured the rituals themselves passed the same explanations to their daughters. They warned them to be obedient, to avoid speaking of what they felt, and to accept confession afterward. This ensured that the silence endured. Even when women whispered to one another, they lacked the vocabulary to describe their experiences honestly. The words had been stripped away, replaced with spiritual codes that kept them dependent on others. The consequences extended far beyond individual treatments. By redefining bodily pleasure as a spiritual reaction, medieval society entrenched a worldview where women were not allowed to recognize themselves as capable of desire or even natural responses. Their bodies were framed only as sites of corruption or purification, never as their own. The impact of this denial was profound, shaping attitudes for centuries to come. In the end, what remained was a cycle of ritual and silence. Women trembled, their reactions rebranded as holy signs, and their comfort was buried under guilt. Communities applauded what they saw. Priests declared victory, and women themselves were left with nothing but confusion. Their bodies spoke clearly, but their voices were pulverized. This pattern of redefining female experience set the stage for even more deliberate uses of control. The idea that pleasure could never be named allowed men to use it as a tool, calming women who were restless and turning their reactions into evidence of obedience. What began as superstition soon became a method of shaping behaviour. The normalisation of this logic marked a turning point. If a woman's own sensations could be taken from her, then her very will could be moulded to fit the demands of authority. What started as trembling in smoke-filled rooms grew into a practice of using the body itself as a means of control. The memory of these rituals leaves us with a haunting picture women forced into silence. Their natural responses twisted into tales of spirits and punishment, their peace forever mingled with shame. Yet this was not the end. From these chambers emerged a new use of the body's reactions, one that moved beyond superstition into outright manipulation, where husbands and priests alike found ways to use pleasure as a weapon of obedience. As the medieval rituals around women's bodies became more accepted, something shifted in how they were used. What had once been explained as purification or healing slowly turned into a deliberate method of control. Families and communities began to notice a pattern. Women who left treatment chambers returned quieter, calmer, and more willing to obey. This observation did not stay confined to priests or healers. Husbands recognized it as well, and they began to send their wives for sessions not because of illness, but because of defiance. What started as superstition evolved into a tool, one that blurred the line between medicine and discipline. The logic was simple. A wife who argued, resisted, or expressed dissatisfaction could be described as suffering from unrest in the womb or imbalance of the humours. The solution was to send her to a priest or healer who would subject her to the usual rituals of smoke, heat, or massage. After the session, her body often reacted in ways that left her physically drained but emotionally subdued. She returned home calmer, less likely to resist her husband's will. To outsiders, this looked like healing. To the men who arranged it, it was an effective way to restore obedience. It is grimly ironic that what was called medicine became little more than enforced submission disguised as care. Priests encouraged the practice because it reinforced their authority. Every time a woman left their chamber subdued, it was taken as proof of spiritual power. Husbands trusted them more, communities relied on them more, and the cycle deepened. Women were told that their own resistance was sickness, that obedience was health, and that the rituals were the cure. With every repetition, the idea became more natural, until few questioned whether it was truly about healing at all. The rituals themselves did not change much. Women were still placed in darkened rooms, subjected to incense, herbs, and physical handling, but the intention behind them had shifted. The goal was no longer simply to rid women of melancholy or possession. It was to break their will. The trembling and gasping that once confused families were now interpreted as signs that the woman's defiance had been burned away. Her calmer state afterward was celebrated as proof that order had been restored. If compared with today, it would be like sending someone to a doctor, not for health concerns, but for the purpose of making them more obedient at home. For the women, this new use of the rituals was devastating. They understood that their own bodies had become weapons turned against them. Relief was mixed with shame, calmness with guilt. They were trapped in a cycle where their natural reactions were used to justify their submission. Speaking out was impossible, since to do so would mark them as sick once again, requiring more treatment. Silence was the only choice left. The practice also widened the gap between men and women in daily life. Husbands gained a convenient way to enforce authority. Priests gained more influence over families, and women lost what little agency they had. The treatments became less about health and more about discipline, less about relief and more about conformity. Over time, the association between disobedience and illness became so strong that women themselves began to accept it. Many came to believe that their resistance was indeed a symptom of sickness, not a natural expression of frustration or independence. Inside communities, this logic spread quickly. Families spoke of wives or daughters needing correction and turned to the church for solutions. Neighbours whispered of women who'd been healed after treatment, using the word as a euphemism for being subdued. The more the pattern repeated, the harder it became to see it for what it was. Authority hid behind the language of care, making it nearly invisible. I find it chilling to imagine how ordinary people accepted this arrangement, never questioning that healing was being confused with control. This shift in purpose reveals a deeper truth about medieval society. Knowledge of women's bodies was never simply about health, it was about power. By naming disobedience as sickness and by using rituals that forced visible reactions, men could reshape women's behaviour without ever admitting it was punishment. The body became the battlefield, and the language of healing disguised the victory. The cycle also ensured dependence. Once a woman had undergone such treatments, her family was likely to send her again at the first sign of defiance. The rituals became self-perpetuating, reinforcing the idea that women needed correction and ensuring that priests and healers remained central to family life. Every session reinforced not just authority over the body, but authority over the household. For the women, there was little hope of escape. Their experiences were stanced, their sensations renamed, and their behaviour shaped to fit expectations. What should have been their private truth was turned into public evidence against them. Relief, when it came, was bound tightly with shame, ensuring they could never claim it as their own. The history of this practice exposes how quickly superstition can be reshaped into control. What began as attempts to understand female illness ended as a method of enforcing obedience. The shift was subtle but powerful, leaving women trapped in a system that used their own bodies to keep them silent. This pattern did not stop at obedience within households. As the rituals spread, women themselves began to seek them out, claiming to feel unwell in ways that would bring them back to the chamber. Some understood more than they admitted, using the treatments to find temporary relief, though at the cost of reinforcing the system that bound them. This strange contradiction marked the next stage, where women's repeated returns confused even the priests who carried out the rituals. As the rituals of cleansing became more common, a curious pattern began to appear. Women who had already undergone treatments returned to the convents or healers' chambers asking for more. They described themselves as unsettled, restless, or weighed down by vague discomforts. Their words were imprecise, a heaviness in the body or a cloud in the mind, but they were convincing enough to justify another session. Families accepted these explanations, believing their daughters or wives still carried hidden impurities. The priests in attendance, though puzzled, did not refuse. Under the language of medicine and purity, each request was framed as legitimate, and so the cycle repeated. The frequency of these visits unsettled some of the clergy. They noticed that the same women returned again and again, despite being declared cured after each ritual. What was supposed to be a one-time correction of imbalance became, for some, a recurring need. Women who left the chamber calmer or lighter came back weeks later, claiming that the heaviness had returned. Their persistence made priests uneasy, but the authority of tradition kept them from questioning too deeply. To deny a woman another treatment would mean admitting that the rituals did not work, so the cycle was allowed to continue. It is hard not to see the irony that what was once called a cure became a service that women requested repeatedly, confusing even the men who prescribed it. The women themselves likely understood more than they admitted. They had experienced real relief, whether through massage, steam, or controlled convulsions. Though cloaked in guilt and silence, the comfort was undeniable. Returning to the rituals was a way of regaining that comfort. Even if they had to describe it in the language of illness, they could not speak of pleasure, so they spoke of unease. They could not say they wanted release, so they said they needed cleansing. Their words kept them safe, even as their actions revealed the truth. For the priests, the repeated visits created tension. Some wondered in private journals why the same bodies required so much correction. Others worried that women were becoming dependent on the rituals, using them not for healing but for indulgence. Yet these doubts were rarely spoken aloud. To question too openly would mean undermining the very authority of the Church and its teachings. Silence once again protected the practice. Even as suspicion grew, if we think about this in modern terms, it would be like patients returning again and again for a therapy that doctors doubted. Yet doctors continued anyway because stopping would reveal the weakness of their methods. Communities began to notice as well. In regions with active convents, it was whispered that some women visited far too often. Neighbours speculated about what drew them back, though the rituals themselves remained hidden behind closed doors. The secrecy only fed the curiosity, making the treatment seem even more powerful. The more women returned, the stronger the reputation of the practice grew. What was once questioned became normalised, accepted as part of life in towns and villages. The cycle had consequences beyond the walls of the convent. Women carried with them both the relief of the ritual and the secrecy that surrounded it. They encouraged others quietly, suggesting that it helped with sleeplessness, anxiety, or unspoken troubles. In this way, the practice spread through word of mouth, even though no official records or teachings acknowledged its real effects. Knowledge circulated in whispers, reinforcing the idea that women had discovered something valuable. though forbidden to name it. Priests faced the contradiction of promoting a treatment they could not fully explain. They reassured families that the rituals worked, yet privately worried about the constant returns. Some began to impose restrictions, telling women they could not come too often, or that they risked addiction to the process. But these warnings did little to slow the demand. The relief women felt outweighed the shame, and they returned whenever their discomfort grew too heavy. The persistence of this pattern highlights both resilience and desperation. Women were willing to endure secrecy, guilt, and even the risk of suspicion in order to reclaim a small measure of comfort. They adapted the language available to them, framing their needs as illness so they could safely request more treatments. This quiet act of agency, though hidden, reveals how women carved out ways to navigate systems built to silence them. I cannot help but see in their repeated returns a subtle form of resistance, a way of reclaiming control over their own bodies even within a structure that denied them words. The repetition of the rituals also altered how they were perceived. What began as extraordinary events tied to spiritual warfare became ordinary occurrences. Women's trembling and collapse were no longer shocking but expected, even routine. The extraordinary had been normalized, creating a culture where repeated submission was woven into daily life. This normalization blurred the line further between healing and control, making it even harder to question. By the later medieval period, these patterns were entrenched. Convents continued to offer treatments, women continued to return, and priests continued to struggle with doubts they rarely voiced. The silence preserved the system, but beneath it, cracks had begun to form. Some clergy recognized the contradiction, noting in their journals that the persistence of illness might mean the cure was no cure at all. Their doubts, however, remained private, overshadowed by the authority of tradition and the needs of families who demanded solutions. The story of women returning again and again to rituals of cleansing reveals both the limits of medieval medicine and the hidden power of female persistence. It shows how women found ways to seek relief within oppressive systems, and how those systems bent under the weight of their repeated demands. This cycle of repetition prepared the ground for a deeper unease among priests. Some began to write cautiously about the dangers of over-reliance, warning that women might become too accustomed to treatments meant to be rare. Their hesitation marked the beginning of another stage, one where suspicion of the rituals themselves began to creep into the very institutions that had created them. Some priests began to keep quiet records in their private journals, small notes that revealed more doubt than certainty. They described the strange reality that what was called treatment seemed to work, yet they had no explanation for why the convulsions and trembling of the women ended in calmness instead of chaos. These notes were never read aloud in public sermons. They remained hidden in drawers or locked inside wooden chests, because admitting doubt in front of others was too dangerous. But within those faded lines of ink, there was a confession the rituals were effective in ways the priest did not understand, and this made them uneasy. Over time, the priest noticed that women returned again and again, often with the same vague complaints of heaviness or unease. At first, these returns were accepted as normal. A woman might be compared to a field that required regular tending, so their bodies were simply viewed as vessel needing maintenance. Yet after months of repetition, some priests began to call it a problem. They used words like habit or even addiction, as if women were seeking pleasure rather than healing. The label shifted, and the concern grew sharper. Restrictions were slowly introduced. Some priests told women not to come back too frequently, warning them that too much exposure to these rituals would weaken their souls. Others wrote that they would no longer treat women who asked too often, fearing that the act had become corrupted. This was not entirely a matter of morality. It was also rooted in fear. If too many women discovered the sensations for themselves, the authority of the priests would be diminished. The act of healing would lose its mystery, becoming instead a pathway to the personal awareness. This was a fragile balance. On one side was the image of holy power, restoring women through sacred contact. On the other side was the growing realization that these effects came from the body itself, not from prayers or relics. The priests did not want to admit that their touch, their chants, and their rituals might only be disguises for something natural. That admission would undo centuries of control. It is almost comical to imagine holy men writing anxiously about women coming back too often, as if the real sin was scheduling too many appointments. They seemed more worried about losing their authority than about understanding what was actually happening. Each visit became a reminder that the church could not fully contain what it had tried to name as illness. The tension revealed the limits of their system. The priests could ban repeat visits, but they could not erase the memory of what women had felt, once experienced. The sensations lingered in the body. Even if cloaked in shame, the women might not speak openly, but they knew. Some may have started to whisper among themselves, quietly wondering why such peace could be declared sinful. Others likely carried the conflict silently, torn between relief and guilt. In today's world, this conflict might look like patients being warned not to overuse medicine simply because it worked too well. It is like a doctor telling someone not to take their pain relief regularly. Not because it harms them, but because it challenges the doctor's sense of control. The absurdity becomes clear when viewed through a modern lens. The supposed guardians of health were more concerned with authority than with care. The journals that survive tell us less about women's experiences than about men's fears. The writing is filled with worry about excess, corruption, and temptation. The body of the woman was treated as a site of danger, where healing could slip too easily into sin. Yet buried beneath these anxious words is evidence that the priests recognized the truth. They saw that women found comfort, even joy, in these rituals, and they knew that this truth was unstable ground for their power. I cannot help but feel that these private doubts, scratched into parchment by nervous hands, were the closest the priests came to admitting they did not understand the female body at all. Reading them now, it is difficult not to sense the irony. They feared discovery, but the very act of writing down their concerns preserved them for later generations to uncover. Women, of course, continued to attend when they could. Though some were turned away, others sought help in less formal spaces, finding midwives or local healers who were not bound by clerical rules. In this way, the control of the priests began to fray. The rituals no longer belonged only to the church. They were slipping into homes, whispered between women, reshaped by those who dared to touch without permission from holy men. The priests tried to tighten their grip, speaking more harshly about purity and temptation, but the contradiction was already visible. The rituals they had endorsed as healing could not easily be called sinful when they produced relief. Each refusal only deepened the curiosity of the women who had already experienced the results. Prohibition became its own advertisement. The result was an uneasy silence. Priests discouraged frequent visits, women hid their knowledge, and the practice continued under shadows. The tension between suppression and repetition created a fragile system of control. It was not sustainable, but for a time, it allowed both sides to continue pretending. The priests could still call themselves healers, the women could still seek relief, even if they had to mask it as illness. The story of these doubts shows us something deeper about the Middle Ages. It was not only about ignorance or superstition, it was also about power and the fear of losing it. The priests might have prayed for guidance, but what they feared most was not evil spirits. It was the possibility that women would recognize their own capacity for healing and no longer need the church. The writings left behind are fragile threads, but they reveal enough to understand the struggle. They show that even within the walls of authority, there were cracks of doubt. They remind us that control was never absolute, and that knowledge, once felt in the puri, could not easily be erased. The priest tried to call it addiction, but the truth was simpler. Women had found a source of strength disguised as sickness, and that discovery, more than any illness, was what threatened the authority of the church. The priests may have silenced their congregations, but their own pens betrayed them. The act of writing down their fears kept alive the very knowledge they wished to bury. In their attempt to contain the mystery, they exposed it. The story of their doubt is a reminder that even the most rigid systems are fragile when confronted with the resilience of the body. The women who returned again and again were not sick in spirit. They were learning something dangerous, that their bodies contained their own answers, whether or not the church approved. The priests who once claimed certainty ended up questioning their own practices, exposing the cracks in their authority. Their doubts, though hidden, revealed that healing could not be controlled as tightly as they imagined. And from these cracks, new forms of knowledge began to spread, setting the stage for women to seek other ways of care that no priest could fully contain. Away from the heavy stone walls of churches and the whispered instructions of priests, a quieter network began to grow. It was not organized through books or official decrees, but through the daily lives of women who spent their time tending homes, assisting with childbirth, and caring for each other. These women, known as midwives or simply trusted neighbours, began to recognise that they did not need a cleric hovering over them to provide relief. They started to share techniques among themselves, small gestures and careful touches that brought comfort to the body. The words they used were deliberately vague. Instead of naming the act, they spoke of helping, releasing, or bringing balance. Their language was meant to protect them from suspicion, but their actions spoke a louder truth: women could guide one another through what the church called illness, without needing permission. This practice was not bold or rebellious in the open sense. It was quiet, practical, and rooted in survival. Women who had given birth many times knew the aches and tensions of the body. They noticed what calmed pain, what loosened muscles, and what allowed rest after days of exhaustion. They shared these things discreetly, sometimes during childbirth, sometimes during the quiet hours of the evening. In these moments, knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, like a secret inheritance. The church framed women as passive vessels, incapable of understanding their own bodies. Yet here was proof to the contrary. By recognizing patterns and remembering what worked, these women were creating a kind of hidden science. They may not have written treatises or performed experiments, but their collective memory served as a guide. Relief did not always require prayers, relics, or incense. It required trust, touch, and the willingness to believe that comfort was possible without external authority. It's both tragic and amusing to imagine priests worrying about theology while women in kitchens and bedrooms quietly solved problems they never could. These acts of shared care undermined the elaborate structures of ritual and secrecy that the church had built. By keeping their language vague, women kept themselves safe, but the knowledge itself grew stronger with each exchange. There was no single name for what they did. Sometimes it was described as balancing the womb, sometimes as soothing the spirit, and sometimes as simply helping. The refusal to name it directly was more than caution. It also reflected how dangerous naming could be. Once something had a fixed word, it could be targeted by law, condemned by sermons, or burned in books by leaving it undefined. The practice slipped past the nets of authority, became a moving, breathing tradition that could not easily be caught. In a modern sense, this might resemble small support groups where people trade health tips outside the gaze of formal medicine. It is like neighbours sharing remedies while doctors argue over regulations, and sometimes those home remedies are the ones that truly ease suffering. In the Middle Ages, when official structures denied women autonomy, such exchanges carried even greater weight. For the women involved, the results mattered more than explanations. They did not need to know why muscles relaxed, or why sleep came easier afterward. They only needed to feel the difference between tension and calm, between restlessness and peace. That experience spoke for itself, and it became a form of knowledge as real as any scripture. I find it remarkable that in these hidden rooms, women were quietly reclaiming a part of themselves that had been denied by authority. They were not making proclamations or writing books, but they were building confidence in their own ability to manage the body. It was a subtle but profound shift, the first seeds of self-awareness that would later grow into broader challenges to control. Midwives especially became crucial figures in this network. Their work already placed them at the heart of women's lives. They assisted in childbirth, cared for mothers afterward, and were trusted with intimate matters through this role. They naturally became custodians of techniques for comfort. They knew where to press, how to massage, and how to use herbs in ways that soothed the body. These methods might not have been described as sexual, yet they often triggered responses the church labelled sinful. Still, the women trusted their midwives more than priests, because the results were undeniable. The knowledge spread quietly, but it spread widely. Farmers' wives in villages, merchant women in towns, even the servants in noble houses each learned pieces of the practice and carried it further. It was never uniform, never standardized, but always grounded in shared trust. The secrecy protected it, and the lack of structure allowed it to survive. Where official teachings tried to impose order, this underground network thrived precisely because it remained unspoken. This hidden practice also carried a risk. If discovered, women could be accused of indecency, witchcraft, or worse. The lack of words that defined their acts kept them safer, but it also meant they had to walk a fine line between care and danger. A careless comment, an observation by the wrong person, could turn comfort into evidence of sin. Still, the women continued. Their loyalty to one another outweighed their fear. The presence of this quiet rebellion within daily life challenges the way history is often remembered. It was not only priests and kings shaping events. Ordinary women, through ordinary acts, were reshaping their relationship to the body. They were carving out small spaces of autonomy in a world that sought to deny them any. These exchanges did not overturn the system, but they planted seeds of doubt and hope. For every woman who experienced comfort at the hands of another woman, the claim that only priests could heal became less convincing. The power of the church was not absolute, and the body itself whispered its own truths. By the time these practices became more visible in later centuries, they were already deeply rooted in everyday life. The midwives and their quiet helpers had built a foundation of trust that endured through generations. What began as whispered gestures became the earliest stirrings of self-recognition, a subtle rebellion dressed as ordinary care. Women discovered that they could offer each other comfort, even without the guidance of priests, and this quiet support became its own form of strength. Their whispered practices formed the earliest steps toward understanding their bodies beyond the reach of authority. Yet as this hidden network grew, the church began to sense a threat, preparing to strike back at those who dared to heal outside its control. In the fields and cottages of medieval villages, knowledge travelled differently than in towns or monasteries. It did not pass through books or sermons, but through the spoken word, carried in the voices of women who worked side by side. These were the wives of farmers, women who tended animals, hauled water, and managed households while their husbands laboured in the fields. They shared their secrets during long evenings by the fire, while spinning wool or preparing food, in the quiet rhythms of daily life. Among these secrets was a technique spoken of only in whispers, the careful crossing of hands beneath the belly, a motion meant to ease discomfort when the body felt heavy or restless. It was not grand, it was not public, but it spread rapidly. The technique was simple. A woman would place her hand or ask another to press across the lower abdomen, moving in a way that loosened tension. Sometimes herbs were rubbed into the skin beforehand, their warmth adding to the effect. Other times, the motion itself was enough. Relief often followed, the kind of relief that allowed sleep to come easily or soothed pain that had lingered for days. The women did not describe it as medicine or as sin. They simply called it help. Stories of success gave the practice credibility. One wife might say that after her neighbour's guidance, she had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Another might tell of how her mood lifted after days of sadness. These accounts passed quickly through the community. Without books to record them, they lived in memory and repetition, becoming stronger with every telling. The practice grew not through official endorsement, but through trust. The kind of trust that women extended to one another in private spaces. It is almost laughable to think that learned men spent years writing dense texts on the mysteries of the womb, while women in small cottages solved their discomfort with a few well-placed hands. The contrast is stark. While clerics argued about theology and physicians debated theories of wandering wombs, women were busy treating each other in ways that actually worked. The secrecy of these practices made them powerful. By keeping them unrecorded, the women ensured that no one could easily condemn them. Silence became protection. The act of whispering knowledge, of passing it on through stories, created a shield. No parchment could be burned, no official record destroyed, because none existed. What endured was memory, which no priest could confiscate. The speed of oral tradition outpaced that of any manuscript. A book might take months or years to copy by hand, and only a few could ever read it. A story, on the other hand, could leap from house to house in a single evening. It was like comparing a handwritten letter carried by horse to the instant messages we share today. Oral stories were the medieval version of rapid communication. Once a technique was spoken aloud, it spread with remarkable speed. Unbound by the walls of literacy, women clung to this knowledge not only because it helped them, but because it belonged to them. In a world where their bodies were so often defined by others, this was something they controlled. They chose when to share, how much to reveal, and whom to trust. These choices created a bond stronger than rules imposed from above. It was a sisterhood born of necessity. I find it moving that in these exchanges, women were not only treating pain but also building quiet networks of solidarity. Their whispers were more than remedies. They were affirmations that they were not alone, that someone else understood what they felt. This human connection was as important as the physical relief. The spread of such knowledge also highlighted the gap between rural life and official medicine. Priests and physicians rarely visited villages, and when they did, their solutions were often impractical or harsh. Women could not afford expensive treatments or the risk of being shamed. Instead, they relied on each other, turning daily conversations into lifelines of health. The secrecy was not only about avoiding censure, it was also about dignity. Women spoke of their bodies cautiously, shielding themselves from ridicule. Their language was layered with euphemism, avoiding direct references, but leaving no doubt to those who listened carefully. The avoidance of precise words did not weaken the knowledge. In fact, it made it stronger, because the stories could adapt to each listener, fitting into the rhythms of their lives. For many, this knowledge became part of household wisdom, passed down like recipes or weaving patterns. A mother would teach her daughter, who would, in turn, share it with her friends once she married. In this way, the practice became embedded in culture, invisible to those who looked for it formally, yet thriving beneath the surface. The danger, of course, was always present. If a man overheard too much or a priest took an interest, whispers could turn into accusations. Women could be accused of superstition or worse. This risk added weight to their secrecy. They were not merely passing along advice, they were preserving something fragile against a world eager to erase it. Yet despite the risks, the knowledge spread by trusting one another. Women found ways to keep control over their own comfort. They proved that resilience did not always come from open rebellion. Sometimes it came from the quiet endurance of memory, spoken from mouth to mouth, defying the silence imposed by those in power. This story of peasant women shows how history is not only shaped by kings and priests, it's also shaped by the countless unnamed women who carried each other through suffering with nothing more than words and trust. Their contribution might be invisible in official chronicles, but it was vital for survival. Without their whispered cures, many would have endured pain in silence. Instead, they found relief, even if they had to hide it. In the long arc of history, these whispers matter. They represent the first stirrings of self-awareness, the beginnings of a recognition that women's bodies were their own to understand. Each story told was an act of quiet resistance, ensuring that knowledge outlived oppression. Women in villages carried their cures not through books but through voices, creating a web of shared care that no authority could fully erase. Their whispered exchanges offered both relief and solidarity, showing that sadhus could hide strength as well as fear. Yet as this hidden network grew louder in its effects, those who ruled through doctrine began to look for ways to stamp it out, turning whispers into targets of suspicion. As the whispers among women grew louder in their effects, the church began to take notice. What had once seemed like harmless household habits soon came to be viewed as threats to authority. Priests and bishops did not see healing hands or gentle remedies. They saw women stepping outside the lines that had been drawn for them, claiming a form of care that bypassed the sacred framework of ritual. This was intolerable in a system that believed control over the female body belonged to men and to God, never to the women themselves. The church responded in the only way it knew how, with sharper rules, harsher sermons, and heavier punishments. The language of sermons became fierce. Priests warned that women who treated each other outside a holy oversight were tampering with sin. They accused them of opening doors to demons, of weakening their souls by relying on each other instead of the sacraments. The word purity was repeated often, but in practice it meant obedience. Women were told that if they sought relief outside the church, they were corrupting not only themselves, but their entire households. Fear was the weapon used to drive them back into submission. Confession became another tool of control. Women suspected of self-treatment were pressured to admit their supposed sins. Confessors asked leading questions, seeking proof of guilt even where none existed. A woman who admitted to anything, even vague gestures of self-soothing, could be punished by penance, public shame, or exclusion from the community. The process was designed less to heal the soul and more to reinforce power. It is almost darkly humorous to think that easing a stomachache could land a woman in the same category as a heretic. But for the church, the real crime was independence, not the act itself. Some women faced harsher outcomes. If they resisted confession or if rumours spread too far, they could be put on trial. Accusations of sorcery or moral corruption hung in the air, and even if they were not executed, they could be expelled from their homes and villages. This punishment was especially cruel in a world where survival depended on community ties. To be cast out was often worse than any physical suffering. The church framed these actions as a spiritual necessity. Officials claimed that without strict boundaries, society would collapse into chaos. They believed that only male-guided rituals could cleanse the soul and the body. Yet what they really feared was the loss of their monopoly over care. The women's practices were effective enough to be noticed, and that effectiveness was dangerous. It suggested that women could survive without clerical authority. In some cases, officials even went after midwives, accusing them of improper practices. These women, once trusted figures in their villages, became targets. Their knowledge of herbs and massage, once celebrated, was rebranded as suspect. A healer could quickly be transformed into a threat, not because she harmed anyone, but because she dared to operate without male oversight. It was like modern regulators shutting down neighbourhood clinics, not because they failed patients, but because they competed with larger, more powerful institutions. Control was the true aim, dressed up in the language of morality. The fear spread among women, but so did resentment. Many must have wondered why something that brought peace and relief could be branded evil. They obeyed outwardly, but inwardly they carried questions. These doubts were dangerous, but they were also seeds of change. The more women experienced the gap between their lived reality and the church's decrees, the harder it became to silence them completely. I find it deeply striking that what the church feared most was not sin itself, but the possibility of women learning that their bodies were not mysteries after all. This reveals the fragile foundation of its authority. True faith should not fear knowledge, yet the church feared even the smallest discovery. It tells us that the balance of power was never as stable as it claimed to be. Despite the punishments, women did not stop entirely. Some grew more cautious, hiding their practices more carefully. Others passed their knowledge only within the closest circles of trust. The rituals may have grown quieter, but they did not vanish. The need for relief was too strong, and the bond between women too enduring to be erased by threats alone. The church's crackdown reveals a paradox. By reacting so forcefully, it confirmed that these practices had a real impact. If they were meaningless, there would have been no need for punishment. The very act of suppression proved the value of what women were doing. This paradox did not go unnoticed. Even in silence, women must have recognized the irony. Villages adapted. Women still exchanged knowledge, but they did so under layers of secrecy. Gestures became more subtle, words more coded. They masked their remedies as ordinary household routines. A hand across the belly might look like nothing more than comfort. Herbs might be presented as seasoning rather than medicine. The line between daily life and secret healing blurred, making it harder for authorities to detect. The suppression of women's healing is part of a larger pattern that echoes through history. Those in power often target not what is dangerous, but what is independent. By controlling access to health and knowledge, they keep populations dependent and obedient. The medieval church was no exception. Its effort to crush self-treatment among women was less about protecting souls and more about preserving dominance. And yet, for all the effort, the crackdown could not erase what women had already learned. Once a woman knew that relief was possible, she carried that memory with her, even if she had to bury it beneath layers of guilt. Knowledge may be silenced, but it is rarely destroyed. It lingers, waiting for a moment to resurface. The crackdown by the church turned whispered acts of comfort into crimes, showing just how fragile its grip truly was. Women retreated into secrecy, but their knowledge endured in ways no punishment could fully erase. From this tension grew even bolder challenges, where hidden books and forbidden healers would face flames in the name of purity. Across medieval Europe, knowledge was never safe when it conflicted with authority. The church had already tightened its grip on women's bodies by suppressing whispered practices, but written records were seen as an even greater danger. Unlike oral traditions, books and manuscripts could not be easily denied or reshaped. They carried permanence, a weight that could outlast sermons. Some texts, often written by female healers or by male physicians willing to record what they had observed, included descriptions of techniques for massage, fumigation, or herbal treatment of the womb. To the church, these writings crossed a line. They gave visible form to knowledge that was supposed to remain hidden. The accusation most often levelled against these works was indecency. Any discussion of the female body outside the language of purity was branded obscene. Words describing physical touch, even when written clinically, were seen as dangerous. To clerics, they were not medicine but temptation. Books that recorded women's experiences or remedies became suspect objects, their very existence threatening to unravel carefully constructed boundaries. Fire became the solution. Burnings of such texts took place both publicly and privately. In some towns, books were confiscated and destroyed in the fire or presence of witnesses, turning the event into a lesson. People were told they were watching sin being consumed by flame. In other cases, manuscripts were taken quietly, disappearing into church fires without ceremony. The effect was the same erasure. The official narrative was preserved, while alternative knowledge was literally turned to ash. Women who authored or preserved these works faced grave risks. A midwife with a collection of notes could be accused of witchcraft. Her familiarity with the female body was reframed as a pact with evil. Herbalists who explained the use of plants for easing pain were rebranded as corrupters of purity. Punishments varied: fines, exile, or in the worst cases, death. But even when lives were spared, reputations were destroyed. The knowledge itself, once captured in ink, was treated as evidence of guilt. It is almost absurd to imagine men in robes trembling over a few lines of text about abdominal massage, as though parchment had the power to topple kingdoms. Yet that fear reveals the truth. They knew how fragile their authority was when confronted with written proof that women could care for one another. The destruction of these texts was not only about morality, it was about control of history. By eliminating alternative records, the Church ensured that the story of medicine would be told through its own lens. Future generations would read only what had been approved, never knowing what had been lost. Entire traditions of female healing, carefully observed and transmitted, disappeared without a trace. What survived was a distorted picture, crafted by those who had no direct understanding of the womb they claimed to govern. In today's terms, this resembles the suppression of medical studies that threaten powerful industries. It would be like burning research on safe treatments simply because it challenged profitable but harmful practices. The pattern is familiar: erase what threatens authority, even if it saves lives. Replace it with doctrine, even if doctrine causes suffering. I find it deeply unsettling that entire generations of women were denied access to knowledge simply because it was written down. Oral traditions could slip by, but once words appeared on a page, they became a target. The destruction was not random. It was a deliberate rewriting of history, a way of ensuring that women remained ignorant of their own bodies. Yet even in the face of suppression, fragments survived. A few manuscripts hidden in monasteries or private collections carried whispers of what had been erased. Scholars centuries later would uncover these traces, piecing together the reality of female healing traditions. The survival of even a handful of texts shows how resilient the desire for knowledge truly was, but compared to what was lost, these remnants are only shadows. The persecution of women healers reveals the hypocrisy of the age. While priests condemned massage or fumigation as indecent, they themselves continued practices that mirrored them in cloaked rituals. The difference was not in the action, but in who controlled it. When men performed it under the name of the church, it was holy. When women did so among themselves, it was witchcraft. This double standard preserved authority at the cost of truth. Communities felt the loss as well. Women who had once relied on local healers found themselves without trusted figures. Some turned back to priests, submitting to treatments that were more about ritual than relief. Others continued in secret, but the fear of discovery made their work harder. What had once been shared openly within households was now burdened with suspicion. Every gesture risked accusation. The burning of books was also symbolic. It sent a clear message: women were not meant to be authors of their own history. Their voices, when written, would be silenced. The physical act of fire-consuming parchment reinforced the belief that female knowledge was dangerous, unholy, and dispersible. It was a spectacle designed to teach obedience. Despite the destruction, the memory of what had been lost lingered in the minds of those who had seen or heard of the texts. Stories of women accused of manuscripts taken were passed on like warnings. These stories ensured that even if the exact content of the books was gone, the sense of injustice endured. The women who lived through these events carried the weight of both fear and defiance. The long-term consequences were profound. Generations grew up without access to medical traditions that might have eased their suffering. Instead, they were left with superstition dressed as doctrine. The erasure of texts meant that when later physicians began to write new medical works, they built upon the incomplete foundations. The gap was deliberate, engineered by those who valued power over truth. In the end, the flames consumed more than parchment. They consumed trust, silencing voices that could have reshaped how women understood themselves. The church may have believed it was preserving purity, but what it truly preserved was ignorance. That ignorance became the legacy passed down through centuries. The destruction of these healing texts left women with silence in place of knowledge, replacing potential understanding with fear. Communities were robbed of voices that might have guided them, and history itself was rewritten to erase their contributions from those ashes. A new strategy emerged, directing women toward marriage as the proper cure for all their troubles. When the flames had silenced the books and punishments had scattered midwives into shadows, the church proposed a simpler answer. Women, they said, should marry. Marriage was presented as not only a duty but also a remedy. A husband, it was claimed, would regulate the womb, stabilize the mind, and ensure that strange illnesses would vanish. The logic was clear in the eyes of clerics. Women did not need rituals or secret practices. They only needed a man. Sermons carried this message with authority. A young woman showing signs of unease was told her problem was not medical but marital. Priests advised fathers to arrange matches quickly, assuring them that a husband would keep their daughters healthy in both body and soul. The burden of treatment was shifted from the priest's hand to the husband's bed. In this way, the church wrapped control of women's health into the structure of the household. The marriage cure was not only a suggestion, it became an expectation. A woman who resisted marriage risked being labelled stubborn or even sick. Her refusal was cast as dangerous, a rejection not only of family duty but of divine order. In communities already shaped by fear and suspicion, the pressure was immense. The assumption behind this cure was blunt. A husband was thought to provide regular sexual release, preventing the womb from wandering or the mind from slipping into melancholy. The act of sex itself was reframed as a therapeutic obligation, not for pleasure but for order. The wife's role was to submit, believing that compliance would keep her body free of illness. It is almost comical to picture priests declaring that the ultimate treatment for women's ailments was simply a wedding ring, as if vows could replace medicine. The reduction of complex physical and emotional experiences to the convenience of marriage shows how little effort was made to understand women on their own terms. For many women, marriage brought no relief. Instead, it added new layers of stress, domestic duties, pregnancies, and the constant expectation of obedience often worsened the very conditions it was meant to cure. But the church rarely blamed marriage. If a woman continued to show signs of restlessness or sorrow, the fault was said to lie with her. She was accused of weakness, of excessive appetite, or of failing in her role as wife. The cruelty of this logic lay in its circular nature. Marriage was declared the cure, and if the cure failed, the blame still fell on the patient. Women could not escape the system, because every path led back to submission. Their bodies were interpreted through the lens of obedience, never through the reality of their own experiences. In modern terms, this is not far from prescribing the same treatment for every condition regardless of the symptoms. It would be like a doctor today telling every patient, no matter their illness, that the cure is to sign a contract with someone else. The absurdity highlights how little the system cared for individual health. The goal was not healing, but conformity. I cannot help but think about how many women must have entered marriages believing they were stepping into treatment, only to find themselves trapped in something far harsher. The betrayal must have been immense, replacing hope with disappointment, and turning the promise of healing into a lifelong burden. Some women may have tried to make sense of it. They convinced themselves that stability came from obedience, that their unease was a sign of poor faith rather than poor health. Others suffered quietly, their conditions untreated, their questions unanswered. The silence was maintained because breaking it risked shame. The household became another layer of control. Husbands, empowered by the idea that they were healers, saw their authority reinforced. The church no longer needed to monitor every woman directly. Marriage extended its influence into every home, making the husband an instrument of regulation. Women were told to be grateful, even when the cure brought more suffering than relief. For those without husbands, the situation was worse. Widows or unmarried women were often seen as unstable by default, their very independence framed as sickness. They faced suspicion, pity, or scorn, and were pressured to marry quickly or risk being ostracized. In this way, marriage was not only a cure, but also a mandate. Communities absorbed these lessons, Families treated marriage as a form of protection, both spiritual and social. Fathers arranged unions not only to secure alliances, but to protect daughters from accusations of disorder. Mothers counselled compliance, passing along the belief that health depended on submission. The cycle continued, reinforced with each generation. And yet, doubt lingered. Some women knew from experience that marriage did not erase their unease. Others whispered of neighbours who seemed no better off despite obedience. These doubts rarely became open challenges, but they simmered beneath the surface. The official story of marriage as a cure remained dominant, yet it was never fully convincing. The Church did not care that the cure was incomplete. It served its purpose by reinforcing male authority. In this sense, the marriage prescription was effective not as medicine, but as control, transformed private suffering into a public structure, binding women more tightly into roles from which escape was nearly impossible. What was lost in this process was the possibility of genuine understanding. Women's bodies became tools for maintaining social order, rather than subjects of care. Their pain was redefined as rebellion, their pleasure as sin, and their healing as obedience. The truth of their experiences was erased in favour of doctrine. The marriage cure reveals how the boundary between health and morality was blurred beyond recognition. It shows how an entire system could mask domination as care, convincing generations of women that their bodies were illnesses waiting for men to fix. The belief that marriage itself could cure women's troubles turned personal lives into extensions of doctrine, trapping them in roles disguised as remedies. What looked like care was really control, and those who suffered were blamed for their own pain. From this framework of obedience, the silence around women's bodies deepened, leaving young girls to grow up in ignorance about themselves. Young women in the Middle Ages grew up under layers of silence. Their bodies were mysteries they were not meant to understand, spoken of only in terms of sin, purity, or obedience. They were taught how to pray, how to serve, and how to obey, but not how to interpret the signals of their own flesh. Pain was something to be endured, fear was something to be accepted, and any stirrings of pleasure were branded as dangerous intrusions. In this atmosphere, ignorance was not an accident. It was carefully maintained as a method of control. The education of girls rarely included anything about their health. A daughter might be taught to cook, sew, or care for livestock, but nothing about menstruation beyond whispered warnings to remain clean. If she asked questions, she was often scolded or silenced. Mothers, themselves raised in ignorance, had little more to offer than cautions to endure. Fathers never spoke of such matters, and priests only framed the female body as a source of temptation. The result was a cycle of silence, where each generation repeated the same void of knowledge. This ignorance had real consequences. When pain came, whether from menstruation, childbirth, or illness, girls had no framework to understand it. They believed they were cursed, weak, or possessed, because that was the only language offered to them. Even natural processes were framed as threats to morality. The lack of understanding turned every new experience into fear. It is almost ridiculous to think that an entire system decided the best way to manage women was to keep them so uninformed that they mistook their own biology for evil. Yet this absurdity was the foundation of control. Knowledge would have given women power, and power was not permitted. Instead of learning about their bodies, girls were taught to fear them. Any sign of pleasure was treated as a sickness. Any complaint of pain was treated as weakness. This framing ensured that women internalized guilt from the earliest age. Their bodies became burdens, not sources of strength. To question this was to question both family and faith, something few dared to do in comparison today. Most societies at least attempt to teach children basic health education. It is like imagining a modern school removing every biology lesson, leaving students to piece together their understanding from rumours and punishments. That was the reality for young women in medieval villages. Rumour became their textbook, and punishment became their lesson. I cannot help but feel a deep sadness when I think about how many girls grew into womanhood, never knowing that their experiences were natural. Instead of being guided with care, they were left to stumble in the dark, carrying shame that was never theirs to bear. This denial of knowledge was not only cruel but deliberate. The silence also protected the authority of men. Husbands, priests, and physicians could claim expertise precisely because women were kept from gaining it themselves. If a wife did not know what her body was supposed to feel, she could not question whether her treatment was just. If she did not understand her cycles, she could not argue when told her womb was diseased. This ignorance ensured dependence. Mothers often struggled with this reality. Some wanted to tell their daughters more, but feared the consequences. To speak openly could mean accusations of corruption. Better to remain quiet, they thought. Even if it meant watching their children suffer, this silence was passed on as love, but it was really fear, and the cost of breaking it seemed too high. The church reinforced this at every turn. Sermons described women as vessels of temptation, people of bringing ruin if not strictly controlled. This rhetoric made girls feel guilty for simply existing in their own skin. Even before marriage, they were trained to see themselves as flawed, in need of guidance, and unable to trust their own perceptions. Communities supported this silence. Gossip punished those who dared to ask too many questions. A girl curious about her body could be mocked or shunned. Social pressure reinforced what sermons had already declared. The line between morality and ignorance blurred until they became the same. Yet the human body does not stay silent. Pain and pleasure both demand attention, no matter how hard they are denied. Girls who experienced them in isolation must have carried heavy confusion. Some turned to older women for guidance, but even then, the answers were often wrapped in vague warnings. Direct knowledge was withheld, leaving gaps that could never be filled. The lack of education also made women vulnerable to exploitation. Clerics and physicians could claim authority because women had no basis to challenge them. A treatment might be strange or even harmful, but without knowledge, women accepted it as necessary. This dynamic reinforced dependence, keeping the hierarchy intact. What emerges from this silence is not only the absence of information, but the presence of fear. Ignorance became a tool for shaping behaviour. Women who did not know their bodies were easier to control, easier to shame, and easier to manipulate. The absence of education was not neglect, it was a strategy. Over generations, this produced a culture where women were alienated from themselves. Their identities were built on obedience rather than understanding. The body, which should have been a source of resilience, became a constant reminder of weakness. Only those in power could offer explanations, and those explanations always served their authority. The tragedy of this system is clear. Knowledge that could have brought comfort and confidence was deliberately denied. Instead, women was trained to associate their bodies with fear, guilt, and dependence. What was natural was called sinful, and what was harmful was called holy. The cost was borne by every girl who grew up believing that her own flesh was untrustworthy. Young women were left with silence where knowledge should have been, carrying guilt for what was only natural. Their ignorance was carefully preserved as a shield for authority, ensuring dependence across generations. Out of this silence, a dangerous paradox emerged, where even moments of pleasure were twisted into punishments disguised as holy truth. The body has a way of revealing truths even when words are forbidden. In medieval times, women sometimes experienced moments of deep relief during treatments, sensations that loosened their muscles and left them calm. Yet no one was allowed to explain what had happened. These reactions, now recognizable as orgasm, were cloaked in language that avoided naming them. They were called cleansing, purging, or spiritual release, anything but what they really were, for the women themselves. The message was clear: if you felt something pleasant, you must remain silent. Pleasure was treated like an intruder. It was not to be acknowledged, let alone celebrated. A woman who smiled too much after a treatment risked suspicion. If she asked questions, she was accused of curiosity that bordered on sin, and if she dared to speak openly, the consequences could be severe. Sermons warned that such feelings were tricks of the devil. Confession could lead to humiliation. In some cases, women were punished simply for noticing their own reactions. It is almost ridiculous to imagine that a perfectly natural bodily response was treated as proof of corruption, as though women were guilty of being alive. But such was the framework of the age. By refusing to name orgasm, the authorities ensured that women remained in confusion, unable to claim ownership of their own experiences. The silence was not only imposed from outside, women internalized it. They trained themselves to look away from what they felt, to treat their own sensations as shameful. Relief was immediately wrapped in guilt. A body that betrayed joy became a source of fear. Over time, this created an environment where women could not trust themselves. Their own flesh was seen as evidence against them. In comparison, Most societies today at least acknowledge sexual health, even if imperfectly. It's like imagining a world where doctors prescribe treatment but forbid patients from describing their side effects, leaving them to suffer in months. The absurdity becomes clear when modern standards are applied, yet for centuries, this was the lived reality of countless women. I find it painful to think of how many women were left in isolation, believing they were alone in their experiences. Instead of support or guidance, they were met with threats of punishment. What should have been a moment of reassurance became another reason to feel trapped. The refusal to explain orgasm served a purpose. By denying it a name, the church controlled the narrative. If women did not have words for what they felt, they could not form questions, and without questions, they could not demand answers. Language itself became a barrier to understanding. This deliberate vagueness stripped women of the power to interpret their own lives. Communities reinforced the silence. Mothers, even if they suspected the truth, rarely told their daughters. Neighbours avoided the subject, fearing that gossip could lead to suspicion. The cycle of ignorance continued, not because women did not notice, but because they were forced into denial. To survive, they kept secrets even from themselves. The cost of this denial was heavy. Women who experienced pleasure often believed it was sin disguised as relief. They went to confession, burdened with guilt, only to be told to pray harder or to avoid temptation. Instead of learning that their responses were natural, they were convinced that their souls were at risk. The confusion deepened with every treatment, every whispered warning, every unspoken truth. Authorities benefited from this confusion. As long as women could not name their experiences, they could not challenge the authority of priests or physicians. Men remained the interpreters of female bodies, even when they themselves had little understanding. This imbalance of knowledge reinforced dependence. Some women, however, must have sensed the contradiction. They felt relief and yet were told it was wrong. They knew their own bodies more intimately than priests ever could. Whispers of doubt likely circulated, even if only in the most trusted circles. These small doubts, though fragile, were seeds of resistance. The refusal to acknowledge orgasm also reveals how fragile the system truly was. If it had been meaningless, there would have been no need for silence. The fact that so much energy was spent denying it shows how threatening it was. That the body itself undermined the authority of the church, providing experiences that could not be explained away without risk. Over time, this silence became part of the culture. Generations grew up never hearing the word, never learning that their experiences were shared. The absence of language became a form of prison. Women who might have drawn strength from shared understanding were instead left isolated, each believing she was alone. This is the cruelty of denial. It erases solidarity. By stripping women of words, the system prevented them from finding each other. What should have been a bond became a burden, carried individually in shame. The lack of explanation was not ignorance, it was a strategy, designed to keep women divided and submissive. The paradox is haunting. The very treatments meant to suppress women often awakened sensations they were forbidden to acknowledge. Each moment of pleasure was rebranded as proof of weakness, ensuring that even joy became a tool of control. History remembers these silences, not because they were natural, but because they were imposed. The refusal to name what women felt left them trapped in cycles of silence, carrying guilt for something that was only natural. This ignorance was carefully shaped into a cage, ensuring obedience by denying even the language to describe their experiences. From that silence emerged a legacy so powerful that it echoed across centuries, shaping how women saw themselves long after the Middle Ages had passed. The legacy of the Middle Ages did not simply fade when the centuries turned. The control imposed on women's bodies lingered long after cathedrals fell into ruin and kingdoms changed their borders. Even as new sciences emerged, the same silence endured. The female body was still spoken of in veiled terms, its experiences left unnamed or distorted by those who did not live them. What had begun as sermons and rituals became traditions and habits, carried forward into new eras with different clothing but the same logic. The denial of women's pleasure continued to shape medicine. Physicians in later centuries often ignored or dismissed the subject entirely, choosing to focus on male anatomy as the default. When female sexuality was discussed, it was through the same lens of disorder and pathology. Relief was still tied to obedience, and deviation was still branded as illness. The Middle Ages had planted seeds of silence so deeply that even modern systems struggle to uproot them. Women themselves carried the burden of this inheritance. Generations grew up believing that their confusion was their fault, that their bodies were unreliable or broken. Mothers rarely had the language to teach their daughters, and so the cycle repeated, silence passed as modesty, shame passed as morality, and ignorance passed as protection. This legacy of withholding knowledge kept women dependent. Even as society claimed to move forward, it is almost comical in a grim way that for centuries, doctors could map the stars with precision, yet still claimed women's bodies were unknowable. The contrast shows how deliberate the neglect was. Ignorance was not an accident of history, but a decision made and preserved by those in power. The persistence of this silence reveals the power of cultural memory. Even when laws changed and churches lost influence, the echoes of medieval thinking remained. Women were discouraged from asking questions, dismissed when they did, and scolded when they sought understanding. Their experiences were framed as secondary, their pleasure erased from serious consideration. The mystery of the female body became less a scientific problem than a convenient excuse. In modern times, conversations about sexuality are more open, yet the remnants of medieval silence still linger. It is like finding that an old lock still hangs on a door. Even after the building around it has been rebuilt, the lock no longer has a real purpose, but its presence reminds us of the restrictions that once defined the space. That is what the Middle Ages left behind, not only rules, but the habits of silence. I cannot help but feel both frustration and sadness when I see how long this inheritance lasted, stretching its shadow over women who never knew its origin. They lived in centuries far removed from medieval sermons, yet the weight of those sermons still pressed against them. The past does not simply disappear, it lingers in language, in culture, and in the assumptions people make without even realizing where they began. For many women, the silence turned into self-doubt. They believed they were ill when they were simply human. They believed they were sinful when they were simply alive. These distortions shaped marriages, families, and entire societies. Pleasure, which could have been a source of strength, was reframed as danger. Healing, which could have been mutual and supportive, was turned into obedience. The endurance of this silence also highlights how difficult it is to unlearn. Once knowledge is destroyed or forbidden, generations may live without it, never realizing what was lost. This is the deepest wound of suppression, not only the suffering of those who lived through it, but the ignorance passed to those who followed. Entire histories of female experience were erased, leaving only fragments for later scholars to reconstruct. Yet even within this bleak legacy, there were moments of resilience. Women continued to share what they could, in whispers and gestures, keeping alive threads of knowledge that would one day resurface. Their quiet persistence ensured that the silence was never complete. Though the Middle Ages tried to erase their voices, those voices endured in hidden ways, waiting for a time when they could be heard again. The story of orgasm as a treatment in medieval times is not just about misunderstanding, it is about control, silence, and the rewriting of history to serve authority. It shows how natural experiences were turned into tools of power, and how that distortion shaped lives across centuries. The women who lived through it carried both the relief of their bodies and the guilt imposed on them, a contradiction that still echoes today. As history moved forward, the silence shifted but did not disappear. It found new forms in Victorian medicine, in cultural taboos, and in the continued reluctance to treat female sexuality as worthy of study. The medieval legacy stretched far beyond its own age, shaping not only how women were seen, but how they saw themselves. The Middle Ages may seem distant, yet their influence is closer than we think. Every time women are told their questions are improper, every time their experiences are dismissed as exaggeration, the shadow of that old silence reappears. What began in dark rooms lit by candles continues to flicker in modern spaces, a reminder of how long control can endure once it takes hold. The truth is simple, but powerful women were never broken. They were never cursed, never inherently weak, never unworthy of knowledge. They were human beings, carrying the same complexity as men, but denied the language to understand themselves. That denial was the true illness, not the bodies they were forced to doubt. The silence of the Middle Ages became a chain stretching across centuries, binding women in ignorance and guilt. What should have been recognised as natural was treated as sin, and the cost of that distortion shaped entire societies. Today, Remembering this legacy is not only about history, but about breaking the last echoes of silence that still remain. Thank you for listening so patiently to this long journey through forgotten history. May these stories give you both reflection and rest. Have a peaceful night and sleep well.